The next regular planning board meeting will be held on December 4th, 2024, at 7:30 PM via Zoom. Roll call, please, Yamilet.
Mr. Alpert,
Here.
Mr. Cardoso,
It's all, hey, it counts.
Timing is everything.
Swift.
Mr. Alpert. Here. Mr. Klein,
Here.
Mr. Wilks,
Here.
Council President Rutherford,
Here.
Mayor McCartney,
Present.
Mr. Guarino,
Oh, present.
Chairman Bago.
Here, thank you. At this time, ladies and gentlemen, I make a motion that the planning board move to executive session.
Second, Mr. Chairman.
All in favor, say aye. Opposed, say nay. The ayes have it. We're going to go into executive session. Yeah.
Right up here. Yeah. Small chair. Or a bigger table. Smaller table. That was probably. Yeah.
That's what you love.
All right.
I make a motion, we reconvene the planning board meeting.
Second, Mr. Chairman.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed, say nay. All in favor, ayes have it. We reconvened at 6:55 PM. I make a motion that we approve PB 24-18 Turtleback Zoo Australian Outback Draft Resolution to send up to the town council that this application falls within the guidelines of the master plan. Do I have a second?
Second.
Council President seconds on the motion.
Mr. Alpert,
Yes.
Mr. Klein,
Did I hear for that?
for the ordinance, oh, you haven't heard any. Oh.
Yeah, I don't think I was here.
Mr. Cardoza,
Yes.
Ms. Casper,
Yes.
Thank you.
Council President Rutherford,
Yes.
Mayor McCartney,
Yes.
Mr. Guarino,
Yes.
Chairman Bottle.
Yes, motion is adopted. Will you swear in our township professionals, Ms. McGovern? Please.
Mr. Hess and Ms. Now, please raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I did.
Thank you. In order to comply with the Open Public Meetings Act, Chapter 231, Public Law 1975, the following is in the annual notice of public meetings of the Township of West Orange Planning Board during the year 2025 has been posted on our bulletin board. Does anybody have a question on the board about Mr. Klein?
Are the site plan review advisory board meetings going to now be in person or are they still going to be via Zoom? There's Zoom, okay, because it says in person here.
It says in-person.
No, for the site plan review advisory.
Spratt.
Zoom, okay, so that's got to change, right?
Do any other members of the board have any questions? Seeing none, I make a motion that we adopt this meeting schedule for 2025. Do I have a second?
Second, Mr. Chairman.
Vice Chairman seconds. On the motion, Yamilet.
Mr. Alpert,
Yes.
Mr. Klein,
Yes.
Mr. Wolf,
Yes.
Mr. Cardoza,
Yes.
Ms. Casper,
Yes.
Council President Rutherford,
Yes.
Mayor McCartney,
Yes.
Mr. Guarino,
Yes.
Chairman Bottle.
Yes, motion carries. PB 24-01 West Essex Highlands Incorporated Block 179, Lot 32, Zone IH1, Warner Road. We now have Mr. Wayne DeFeo, who was in the middle of questioning by the public about his testimony. Do any members of the public have any questions for Mr. DeFeo on his testimony? Please come up to the mic.
Just for the record, is this on? Mr. DeVere, you're still under oath.
Thank you. State your name for the record, please, young lady.
Yes, the name is Barbara White, and good evening to everyone. And Mr. DeFeo, this is actually a continuation of the questions I started asking you the last time.
Okay.
And the first is, during your testimony, you cited one or two successful reforestation efforts through the use of deer fences. If there's an opportunity for more members of the community, and I wanted to ask a couple of questions on my behalf and on behalf of my friends and neighbors. With respect to the reforestation projects that you looked at, and are any of those in what I would call encapsulated neighborhoods that are similar to what we have in this particular petition, which is 500 plus residences in the middle of an area that is highly restricted?
I can't speak to the demographics of your
Mhm.
question. Are they within 500 homes or is it encapsulated?
Whatever.
The closest fenced areas to you
Mhm.
or to West Orange, to be more
Okay.
specific, would be the reservation, South Mountain Reservation. There are encapsulated areas in there, meaning there are deer fenced areas in there, as well as open areas. And clearly South Mountain Reservation, though much larger as a piece of property, is surrounded by residential.
Okay, so that's really, my question really is, I probably wasn't very clear, is within the areas are encapsulated. And we're looking at a property that has one road in and one emergency road out. Have you seen any areas where you had large condensed dwellings where most of it has deer fence and other barriers to being able to readily get out in the event of a project-wide emergency?
Not certain about the question.
Mhm.
None of these are generally planned around that.
Yeah, and that's really is my
But
question.
there is more,
Some
just
are
as a
planned
point,
around.
I'm not the planner, but as a point of information, as I've read the plans,
Mhm.
there actually are 3 points of access and egress to that property, not one. So that would not be an accurate statement to say there's only one egress or access point. That's the only thing I could answer to.
Okay, so I guess, but make sure I'm very clear in understanding that. In the work that you did, determining that there was a like kind situation in other properties versus this one, you did not look at or encounter any area where you had heavy forestation, limited access on uneven terrain that had a large apartment unit or many units in the middle of it.
Specifically, it was not a site-specific analysis, no.
Okay,
Of
that
other
was
type.
question one.
wouldn't
And
be relevant.
got another one. And this one, again, may be, again, out of your primary background and information,
Mhm.
but I am also curious that you had the opportunity on several occasions to walk the full property and to get, some pretty decent familiarity based on your qualifications. I'm curious about if you have any thoughts about what you might have seen or might have thinking in terms of the ability for anyone to respond if we were to have something similar to what we had right now in New Jersey, fast-moving fire in a relatively small place.
Well, again, as I think this question had come up last, whatever week
Mhm.
that was, I'm not sure the date
Yeah,
now.
I'm losing track of time too.
But to answer the question, I'm not a qualified fire expert.
Mhm.
But I would say to you that as of right now, the property has limited access, as there was any wooded property. In fact, there's no technical access to the property today by road.
Mhm.
I would say just by observation and common sense, the property will have road access and fire hydrants, which it does not today. So in light of today's fire emergency scenario that we have statewide, first of all, no one could predict this. No one can design around this.
Mhm.
The simple fact is that this property today is fully exposed. Just again, using a common sense analysis, in the future, the property would have road access and fire hydrants, which it does not have today.
Right, and what you wouldn't be able to speak to, I'm sure, is the adequacy of what is in the plan relative to those
The
things.
fire
So that
department
really
would
is my
have to do
question.
that.
Those
That
are my
would be a
questions.
fire department question.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, may I ask,
Council President Rutherford.
How many points of ingress and egress are there to this property?
At present,
Based on the proposed design?
I'm going to leave that. to
I'm
Mr.
only citing based on what I saw on the plans, and looking at the maps, there would be 3.
Is that the board's understanding? Mr. Hazel, Mr. Hess?
It does show 3. They have asked that one not be put in initially, the one to have 2. And the other one, what they were asking that be held in the reserve.
So based on I just want to be clear. So based on the way it's proposed today, there's one mode of ingress, egress for regular traffic and one in case of emergency. So there would be 2 in case of emergency, but 1 on a regular basis. Is my understanding correct?
They have a normal, regular access on the southerly side of the site with the second one that's proposed, but they're asking that not be installed. And then they have an emergency access on the northerly side of the property.
And the second one that they're reserving, is that because of any settlements or other agreements with other townships?
No, not that I'm aware of. I believe they asked, they've shown it on the plan. They've requested that the board waiver to not require it to be put in, but that's a board decision.
So they are allowed to have 2 points of ingress egress without violating any of the agreements they currently have.
We're not
And
talking-
one additional
We're
one
not
was,
talking about an agreement. We have a zone plan. It has to go with the zone
They-
plan, sir.
I think Mr. Blocker
Yeah.
can speak to this a little bit more.
Yeah,
carefully.
I think Mr. Hess got, as Brian Plocker, Hutch Manowitz and Plocker on behalf of the applicant. I think Mr. Hess, your engineer, I think he got it right at the end, is that the plan, the site plan as submitted does propose the access on Kuzik Drive. However, we have requested a de minimis exception from RSIS to have Kuzik serve as emergency access only.
so that would be 2.
What I said is what's on the plan.
No, how many?
Well, I'd like
how
to
many-
understand. I mean, I need to understand it in layman's
It would be
terms.
what's proposed right now before we get into any exceptions or waivers would be access via Warner Road and Kuzik Drive with emergency access up off of Howell Drive. The application that's before the board that was applied for and what the board is going to consider now seeks a de minimis, it seeks an de minimis exception from RSIS to have the Kuzik Drive access serve as emergency access only.
Got it. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Sir, come up to the mic, state your name, please.
I'm Werner Heck. I live on 84 Davy Drive in the West Essex Highlands. Our condo overlooks the where Warner Road ends and the forest begins. I'd like to address Mr. DeFeo's claim of the forest being unhealthy. To demonstrate that, he had compared 2 photos last time he was here. Said one had a very long range of sight.
I'm sorry,
Yeah.
sorry. Could you, the people in the back can't hear you. Could you speak more into the microphone, please? Thank you.
He used 2 photos to support some of his case. One photo showed clearly a very long range of sight in the forest. But to me, that seemed to be a picture of that forest in the wintertime. There were a lot of brown leaves on the ground, and there was no green vegetation anywhere. Then he had the other picture showing a healthy forest. It was clearly in the summer and with a lot of, greenery. So, Mr. DeFeo, do you think that was a fair comparison to show those 2 photos when to me, one seemed to be in the winter and one in the summer?
Well, you're misunderstanding the statement of what a healthy forest is in my point. The point is not that the trees are there. The point is not that there are large trees there. There are indeed large trees there. The health of the forest is determined not so much and totally by the total number of large trees. The forest, as I stated last, was with the trees that are there, with exceptions such as ash and beech in particular, the trees that are there are reasonably healthy. The forest is unhealthy on a long-term basis because there is no under. There are no new trees coming in,
But-
whether it's
but
a
that was
winter or a summer image. is
That was a
irrelevant.
winter photo. You wouldn't expect a large.
Young trees I would see. And the simple fact is, I could go get more photos if you like, but the simple fact is that there is a dearth statistically and scientifically of young trees in that forest. And by every study done statewide, when you have a lack of young trees to replace mature trees as they die, which eventually will happen, you have an unhealthy forest.
That may be so, but I would have preferred to see 2 summertime photos.
Thank you, sir. Please step up to the mic and state your name for the record,
My
please.
name's Peter Guarino. I live in the Highlands, by the way. I'm just confused a bit. This gentleman mentioned 3 points of access and somebody mentioned Kuzik Road as a point of access. Kuzik Road goes into Warner. There's only one means of egress and access. Can somebody explain to me how there's 3 or 2 or?
Mr. Blocker?
I'm certainly not testifying as an engineering professional, but I'll repeat again. So the property is accessed from Eagle Rock Avenue via Oval Road up Warner Road. From that point, the site plan proposes that vehicular or pedestrian traffic can continue up Warner into the proposed development or make a left onto Kuzik Drive.
And Kuzik goes where? Goes into the development, which goes into
We're talking about access to the development up Warner Road. And then you either head up Warner or you would make a left if you were walking up from Oval Road you would make a left. And Kuzik has proposed access to the development, but part of this application is that the access would be there, but we were seeking relief to allow Kuzik access to serve only as emergency access.
So you still only have one means of egress and access.
If your point is that eventually it all goes to Warner Road, that's absolutely correct. But off of Warner
That's the
Road,
point, exactly. There is one means of egress.
Oh, okay, thank you. That's the answer to his answer to the question. Thank you.
There's an incident.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
I don't know what they're.
Hello, Seth Weissletter, from West Orange. So my question is, this being, you stated several times, it's unhealthy forest, mainly due to the deer and wildlife causing the issues. With an unhealthy forest, how are slopes affected by an unhealthy forest? So a steep slope, how would that, there's trees on these steep slopes, would you agree with that?
Try to answer, but if I understand it correctly, so I can answer it. If I understand you correctly, your question is, what is the impact of the forest condition on the steep slope?
Correct.
So again, when we emphasize, people keep using the term unhealthy forest in a sense as if it's being testified to that the forest is dying. I'm not saying that, they've not said that.
No,
That's the way I apply it. There is, however, a lack of undergrowth that is healthy.
Correct.
And there is a lack of new growth. So to answer your question, I think, means that when you have a steep slope and you have a lack of undergrowth on that steep slope, you have more water flow. As the forest becomes healthier and undergrowth becomes denser, it reduces water flow. There are multiple studies around the country that would show that you can have, as you have more growth, more plants, you have more water absorption, and you reduce the flow of water. So to answer your question on the steep slope, where it is proposed to be fenced with deer fencing, the steepest slope of the property have proposed deer fencing on them. Over time, those steep slopes would have new undergrowth because the deer would not be able to browse it, and therefore it would decrease the flow of water.
I agree with what you're saying, but it's not lining up. If we have a map, it looks like the deer fencing is not on the slope. It's after the slope comes down to a plane at the bottom to absorb the water like a sponge, which was testified to last time. So I'm confused that if you're saying there's a lack of growth and a lack of new seedlings that can grow, then how are we protecting the slopes if that could be a problem?
Yes.
That's my question.
Okay. Mr. DeFeo, can you just identify what, for the record, what you're
Yes.
looking at now?
This is one of the. This is one of. No, it's not the one. This is one of the slides from my original presentation of the 30th. And this is a rendering, or if you will, of SP4, which is part of the site plan submitted by the applicant. SP4
Highlighted
shows
deer
a highlight of the deer fencing and is specifically designed just to highlight where deer fencing would be. This is not a topographical map, so bear with me. But this is here, the beginning roughly of the steep slope.
Okay,
So that entire area going down the slope and across would be fenced.
okay. Can you show the topographical map just if that's there?
The next one.
And again, it was more maybe a clarification.
Okay.
Thank you.
So you
Okay,
can see here. You can see here this dark green line.
yeah,
This is the deer fencing. Okay, the red line is an approximation location of the ridge, meaning water flowing on this side of the red line goes down the steep slope. Water falling on this side of this red line goes this way, and you can see this being the steepest slope area, it is encased in deer fence.
okay,
Which
no,
allows-
it's fine. Okay, I agree. We're in agreement. My second question would be, would you recommend any other areas of the forest to be protected for growth based on you and your team's observations?
Well, that's a good question. There are some areas that are just not feasible. One of which is, of course, the wetland area is just makes it very can't go into the wetlands and disturb them. They're protected by state law. So there's very little you could really do in here. There is another wetland area here as well, right along here. So those areas, in a perfect world, while I might deer fence the entire property in a perfect world, it's not feasible or necessary to do so. This and this, the two areas that have been selected, are designed, number one, because they're in the area where there's no disturbance. Number two, they're selected for the reason we just talked about, in part. And number three, in part here, it's selected for the same reason in the other direction, because again, I have steep slope, and I'm trying to increase the overflow, or the goal is to increase plant growth to decrease water flow from interrupting into this area. Now water flow is going to go this way. The rest of this area is contained and controlled, which is not my design, or this is something the state will approve, by a professional stormwater management system to minimize any flow impact. For this area, as we discussed or in previous meetings, I believe, one of the explanations is this area, which of course in the disturbed area, this will be replanted with native plants, which will act as a seed bank for the entire property to allow for more plant growth. Where we can control it, we are doing so here and here, because as these deer fenced acreage, about 33 acres, begins to regenerate, it will then become a reverse seed bank for the unfenced area. And the hope, of course, over time, and what we have seen in studies, is that the entire area will start to see regeneration of growth. The goal being, of course, the hope is that the areas here, which will be planted by the developer, it will be there, I'm sure, will do what they can to protect those plants from excessive drought. And there are many ways to do that, one of which is a deer repellent that can be applied. Which that would be up to them, there's no mandate to do so, of course. But that will then seed these areas. So would I say the whole area should be deer fenced? Probably not feasible, at least in my reviews of it, nor would I say it's necessary completely. Because it would be impossible at that point, I think, to keep and not cause problems with neighboring properties. This gives an area that deer can still, if you will, roam and play in, that's open to them, while protecting the forest and allow it to regenerate. So this is what you call a best of both worlds, as I see it.
Right, so in an approximation, I know it's not a perfect world because there's so many different variables. In an approximation, how long would it take before we see a difference in the deer fenced area to absorb that additional, approximately?
Based on my observations of other deer fenced areas, you can start seeing new growth with 1 to 3 years. You'll start within the first year of seeing low growth fruits, flowers, that sort of thing, ferns. Within 3 years, you'll start seeing the beginning of shrubbery. And then over about 9 to 10 years, over 9 years, this space should virtually be impenetrable from the naked eye.
Mhm.
But I'd say within a year, you'll start to see growth.
Okay, if you don't see growth, is there recommendations to help that growth in that area?
I don't have a recommendation per se, because I've never seen an area that's fenced not show new growth.
Perfect, thank you.
Thank you. Come right up, sir.
Yes, good evening. My name is Randy Cupo. I live in the West Essex Highlands. I just, thank you for your contribution. I just had one quick question. What would you attribute the unhealthy environment to that's in that area? Would you contribute that to the deer, or what would you say?
If you're asking, if I think your question is, why is the forest so unhealthy in my view over its long-term life? It's mostly over deer browse. In any study you'll see, there are some things posted online, you could read if you want to, but you'll look at almost every one of those studies about forest health in New Jersey. In a suburban area like ours, ex-urban area, you will see excessive deer browse is a large and massive problem in this area. So I would attribute that to deer browse.
Okay, so, yeah, so this would be all, you could also consider this a healthy environment due to its deer grazing. Since, in other words, when you have deer grazing, you would have this environment You would expect this environment to be as such.
No, it's not healthy in that regard, because when you have a higher population of deer than the forest can carry, meaning the carrying capacity is exceeded, which is in the findings of this area pretty generally true. In fact, in New Jersey, in urban areas, pretty much generally true, or suburban. Some of the studies show as many as 90 to 120 deer per square mile. The carrying capacity of a normal healthy forest would be 20 deer per square. When you have excessive deer per square mile, generally in an area, we're not just talking about this 120 acres. But when you have excessive deer density, the deer are unhealthy. And it is a sign of unhealth. The herd becomes unhealthy because they do not have enough forage. And the forest itself becomes unhealthy because about the only thing left that will grow after excessive grazing are invasive species, which we see in excess in this property, such as barberry. That's just an example. There are many invasive species, but that's what you will see left, because barberry has virtually no wildlife. And the deer won't eat that. In fact, I haven't seen deer eat that virtually at all, unless absolutely starving, at which point they're not helping.
So in your opinion, you would view this as an area that was over concentrated with deer?
All of West Orange and Essex County is over concentrated.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Krakowiak,
Good evening.
good evening.
Mr. DeFeo, your presentation included a slide called Total Native Plant Additions as Proposed, which summarized the additional plantings the applicant planned to make inside the proposed deer fence to help restore the forest. 279 trees, 1,065 shrubs, and 2,166 perennials, grasses, ground covers, a total of 33,510 plantings. And you said these all, in terms of specific species, are subject to further discussion. So just had a series of questions from that. Who determines this specific proposal, and what are the main factors impacting such a proposed formulation?
So I understand the question. Are you asking specifically about the species being selected as of right now or proposed?
Well, both. It was a compound sentence. I probably shouldn't have done that, but break it into two questions. Who actually determines this proposal, and is there a formula that is generally followed in the industry?
Certainly understand the question.
Okay, are you, Mr. Krakowiak, are you asking the nature of the individual tree? How many elm trees, how many oak trees, which species of trees?
Yes, and
Okay.
the actual number and
There you
who actually does that.
Good, okay.
As far as the specific species of plant that was selected, that is the applicants and made that under consideration. They submitted native species. As I testified, I think in the prior testimony, I stated in at least one case, I have recommended that they consider replacing one of the native species with a second one, because of climate change and the species probably would not do well. In fact, there are a number of studies that show we need to be thinking about planting species that are at the northern range historically of their survival rate, and picking more southern species that will do that. And we've talked about it. As far as the formula itself and this number of trees, the applicants.
Okay, and would the applicant typically hire a forester to help put this proposal together? Would it be a forester or?
Applicants can hire whomever they want. I don't know who they hire.
Okay, so when you say that the proposal is subject to further discussion, do you mean that the planning board can make changes to this proposal as a condition of approval?
I can't answer that.
The planning board can, the planning board can have a condition that a forester will be engaged to review on behalf of the planning board all the trees and growth that will be planted as part of the application, which we've done before.
Okay, so again, I just want to clarify a little bit, and I realize the witness is here as opposed to the chair, but could the board, perhaps upon the recommendation of Mr. DeFeo, say that we need a different number of a particular proposed species, or that we need a different species, as he's already said, has already mentioned? And is that something that the board would have to decide upon as part of their?
The applicant
decision?
will work with the planning board as a condition, whether it's through our forester or their forester with our forester, to make sure that they are non-invasive species and are conducive to the new growth that Mr. DeFeo has been speaking about.
Okay, so let me just throw out a hypothetical. The proposal is for 279 trees. If Mr. DeFeo or a majority of the board said, we think there should be 30 more trees as opposed to what are proposed, is that something that has to be reached by consensus, or can the applicant say, nope, not going to do it?
It would have to be reached by consensus. And the applicant has been very reasonable with this, so I can't speak for Mr. Plucker, he may want to
Yeah,
opine.
I just wanted to say for the record, because I thought this may have come up before and I may have made a representation on behalf of the applicant. If not, I'll make it now. We do have a landscaping plan that's what's before the board. The application complies with the tree requirement of our zoning ordinance. However, we did represent, will continue to represent that as a condition of approval, we will continue to work with Mr. DeFeo, the town forester, or whatever town professionals are going to be involved when we are out in the field and it is time to do these plantings after the buildings are built. And we stand by that representation.
Thank you, Mr. Plucker.
Thank you.
And I didn't want to give the impression that I was questioning that dedication.
No,
that
it's
commitment. I just
it's
was
fine, we
trying to
wanted to be
clarify.
clear for the public.
Okay. This question has to do, Mr. DeFeo, with whether you have been involved in these types of situations where an applicant would propose a plan similar to this to help revive or the forest. Have you done many of these, or approximately?
No, to testify last time, the answer is no, because it's to my knowledge, and talking to other professionals around the state, no one's ever tried to do this. But I mean, it hasn't been done, just to my knowledge. I think.
Okay. And in your professional opinion, other than your suggestion that they change one of the species, is there anything else in the plan at this point that you think should be subject to modification or further discussion?
The existing landscape plan I have reviewed the existing landscape plan, and that was the only thing that I red flagged in it. Other than that, it comes down to nuance. You know, when they get out in the field, when you start planting things, and you may say, I want to put a hole here, you may not be able to put a hole there. So things may have to be moved around a little bit, but that's something, as the chairman noted, in the field, things will of course be shifted, but under this situation, which again, I find highly unusual, is that there will be someone there to look at that and have a discussion with the builder at that point. As to, well, we need to do this, or we need to substitute that. An example might be a species may have been selected, maybe unavailable, that can happen. Then you have to look at a substitute species. So it's not mandating it. To give you an example, it's not going to say you must have a red maple. It might be that, bad example, which there is to get, but if I can't get a red maple, well, then you might have to use a swamp white oak. And I'm just giving you an illustration of two species that can substitute one for the other and still meet the same condition of native plants in the right area. Does that answer your question?
Yes. So just as a hypothetical, if the application is approved and you do move to the building stage and you come into that situation where you feel professionally that there should be a change to the proposal, but the builder is equally convinced that shouldn't make that change, what happens?
I'm sorry, Mr. McGovern.
If you must reach consensus, but you can't reach consensus.
Well, they must work within what's required under the ordinance, which has been set by the township for this site. So there's numbers and basic guidelines. They have to abide by those basic guidelines in the ordinance. Anything above and beyond that would become, I guess, a negotiation after the fact with the spirit of cooperation, but there's only so much that this board can limit them to past what's delineated in the ordinance. And, you know, we have conditions that we can put on, and
Mhm.
they have agreed to several already conditions. But at this point, there's no specifics that we can say, because if and when this project gets built, you don't know what the plants that would be available, or what would actually work at that time.
Considering the township has a forester, we have Mr. DeFeo, and the applicant, I'm sure, will hire their own forester. I'm sure they will come to some consensus in their field of expertise. They wouldn't want to put something that's not going to survive, and they're definitely not gonna put something that's gonna be invasive. So I don't know that you can put those words exactly into as a condition, but we've been in broad brushstrokes, we have those words in the ordinance, and we will condition it as we previously said.
Thank you. Are there any size or maturity requirements for these plantings within the forest?
Nothing that's been specified as this.
Okay, so if it says 279 trees, the trees could be seedlings or they could be,
No, the standard for landscaping in New Jersey generally is a tree has to be 1.5 inches. A seed would be a sapling at that point, 1.5 inches in diameter. It's the generally accepted landscape replacement tree. Whether or not they go larger or not will depend on the site and their final determinations. As I stated last, the fact is that in many cases, we often say, let's put bigger trees in because it has a bigger impact on front. There are two sides to that coin. One is, yes, you can do that. But we also find that larger trees require a lot more care up front, and there's a higher mortality rate from what I've seen. We want to balance those two risks. The goal is to get a tree to grow and hopefully grow fairly quickly.
thank you. You also had on the slide about the native seed mixture for 37,388 square feet. And what is the composition of this seed mixture, and what is it supposed to do? And are you aware of any studies as to the impact it is supposed to have?
I don't have this in my head of the native seed mixture. It was on the landscape plan, which I don't have in front of me. I looked at it is consistent with native plants for this particular part of the country. As far as its impact, I've seen native plant restorations done before, and if they're done well, and both they would do them well, the impact is you get fairly quick germination and you have fairly quick stabilization. I've done two that have worked well, but one particularly that worked fairly well at our environment center in West Orange, and one that didn't work out so well, but that was just due to lack of care. So it really depends on follow-up care, like any seed mixture. You know, if you put seed down on your lawn this fall, probably not going to do there. You know, unless you water it. But in this case, it would be planting at the right time, putting it in the right conditions. I presume we'll get rain again in the spring, you know, that's when those kinds of things be confirmed.
I also have not seen the landscaping plan, so, but it does occur to me that if you've reviewed it before, whether you had any distinctive thoughts about the proposal within the area of disturbance.
My looking at that landscape plan, and I've looked at a lot of landscape plans for developments over the years, being in my own environmental commission, and we reviewed them fairly heavily. This is one of the better ones I've seen. If there was not let me see if I can slip in this species or that species, some arcane hybrid. It was very clean in terms of picking native species and native plants. The layout, I leave to the applicant because it's around their buildings. But even on its face, I didn't see something that would jump out at me and say, oh my goodness, they're putting this tree next to a building, are you nuts? I'm not seeing that kind of error. It looks like they took a fair amount of care. Again, it's not finalized, I realize, but it looked like it was very well done compared to others that I have seen.
Okay. And when you say they're well done, do you think that will be effective in addressing any potential problems with erosion, with soil erosion, or with water runoff?
Well, this particular landscape plan is fundamentally for, let me go back and just show it, because not the landscape plan, but the general area.
Well, my concern is it's the top of the hill, so
Yeah, no.
everywhere is down.
But the landscape plan itself really isn't per se, with the exception of the seed mixture, which helps stabilize soil. This area isn't being planted. This area will regenerate on its own basis. So in terms of erosion and control, if that's their primary concern, the area as it regenerates will take care of that. Where there's disturbed area and they're going to seed that area, the young plantings that come in, because they're herbaceous plantings, not trees or shrubs, will help to stabilize those areas much more quickly. And in my experience, that works out pretty well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Do any member of the public have any questions for Mr. DeFeo about his testimony? Please come up and be recognized. Do any member of the public have any questions for Mr. DeFeo about his testimony? Please come up and be recognized. Say your name for the record, sir.
But yeah, it's Mike McGlade, 55 Lapis Circle. And the mayor, but anyway, I've lived in the community for just about.
Sir, come closer to the microphone. People in the back.
I
Thank
lived in
you.
the homeowner association area for the last 4 years. And my main concern has to do with the water flow and all the trees being cut down. I'm probably the closest unit next to Canoe Brook, literally a couple of feet away from it. We've already had an issue where a tree from the brook after a big storm in the spring was leaning against our house, and then several trees had to be cut down. So my concern is whether all these trees being knocked down and all the construction, if they're about all the water flow, if there's been enough study for the effect on the increased, there's been times over the past year, well, it's not raining now, but last year and early this year was raining quite a bit. And there's been quite a bit of water flow down Canoe Brook, which ends up in the golf course, and it's coming pretty close to overflowing already with all the trees coming down. I'm just wondering about what the effect, besides all the other issues like the parking, I mean the traffic. So that's my concern, but.
Really can't speak to that. That would be an engineering question.
Well, I just wanted to, that's about all I had to say, but just one, that's my concerns.
Okay, do any other members of the public have any questions? Okay, seeing none, Mr. Efron. You're up, sir.
Just give me one moment.
Why is the part-time?
Good evening. The record, I'm Bruce Affron, counsel for We Care New Jersey. Mr. DeFeo, you or your company are presently employed in some capacity with the town, aside from this engagement here. Is that correct?
Yes, I have a separate contract. Yeah, yes.
And what is the subject of that contract?
Is the environmental compliance officer. My fundamental responsibility is to inspect and ensure compliance at the West Orange Recycling Center where the leaves are composted and the wood is processed.
How long have you had that responsibility?
That started on an emergency basis in 2005.
And have you continued in that capacity with the town since 2005?
Yes.
Since 2005, aside from this engagement on this application, have you had any expansion of your responsibilities with the town other than the recycling function?
Yes, I've had one other, which was a one-time processing. Sorry, rephrase that. I worked with the township on the development of its solid waste and recycling bin specifications.
And does that represent the extent of your work with the township aside from this site plan application?
In terms of this specific contracts, I think I had one other short contract working during COVID, helping to develop safety procedures for well health and safety standards. Actually reviewing them would be a better way of putting it. Not developing them. The township had a very good program on its own. The credit of its staff.
Did I understand you to say well, as in well meaning water?
No, well is in healthy.
Okay, so what did that healthy refer, that's why I clarified. What did that healthy element refer to? What type of work?
Well, health and safety means you review both the policies and procedures of the staff and building as well as the nature of what's being done in the building. For example, you go behind you, you'll see an air filtration system in this building. During COVID, those things were put in, again, the township took the initiative in putting that kind of system in place. It was to help review those systems. If you walk into this building, you'll see there's one way in and one way out. You will see hand sanitizers, that sort of thing. It helps to review what are the policies and the procedures with this.
So well as in wellness.
Well,
Good, thank you. I wanted to clarify. Great. Now, tell us what actual specialized training, either academically during your master's degree program or otherwise, you have in forestry.
well, as I've already testified, I am not a forester. I am I'm a biologist with concentrations in botany and anthropology. I have a master's in environmental studies, which you would call today probably sustainability. That was how the title would evolve over time. My concentrations in my master's would have been environmental science, with concentrations also in botany and ornithology, as well as environmental education.
Ornithology as in the study of birds, you said.
Correct.
Now, my question was, what training do you have in the field of forestry?
Stated I am not a forester. I am trained as I would be qualified as a botanist if you were to look at my specialty.
And again, my question was, what training do you have in the field of forestry? Do you have any? If you don't, say no.
Yes, I've taken courses towards getting my degree in botany. I've done, let's see, I have one report that was done, published, where I did my own independent study in a forestry analysis at Valhalla Glen in New Jersey, analyzing the impacts of an insect called Pyrrhenia externiferis, which is a scale insect on the eastern hemlock forest. In that forestry analysis, I would have done a complete analysis using quadrite analysis and analysis of the forest identification. Towards my master's, I would have taught multiple courses in forest management,
I'm sorry, you would have taught or took?
taught multiple courses and taking courses simultaneously in forestry and forest management. I don't know if they even have the certification much, but I was certified as a private learning tree instructor, which was done by the Western Regional Environmental Education Council, where I was trained as an instructor on forestry, REAP and/or project learning tree. Were used to teach curricula on forestry and forest management to teachers in order to teach students about the proper means of forest management. I also would have worked at that time teaching Project Wild, which would have been a wildlife management curriculum. And to answer your question further, the point being that wildlife curricula and forestry curricula and forest management curricula, as well as botany and environmental studies and ecology, all of which was training that I've had. The point being, look at the entire forest. Forester looks at specifically, let me rephrase that, forester looks primarily at forest management. Forest management is different than environmental science and is different than the ecology of a forest. It does not mean a forester does not look at the ecology. What it does mean is that a forester is looking at a forest for a specific reason, typically, not always, but typically, to look at that forest as a harvestable question versus looking at the forest as a healthy ecosystem. We can't have one without the other. So the forester might say, it's okay to plant this species of tree. We'll just pick loblolly pine in the south because it grows quickly. And a forester will look at the spacing and the culling and the speed with which that's done for the purpose of getting the greatest amount of board trees out of that forest in the shortest period of time. The environmental scientists will look at that and say, that forest is not really great and healthy because it's a monoclone. And we don't like that.
We don't have a monoforest here.
You do not, you have an oak, primarily oak mixed.
Now, we do have a town forester, do we not?
You do with the town forest?
That's Mr. Kipp, Walter Kipp, is that correct?
That's correct.
Now, you're not suggesting that he's interested in managing the town forest to sell it as a crop, are you?
It's not.
Then did
He
you
has a
consult,
different-
did you consult with Mr. Kipp before making any recommendations to the town?
He was
with
not
respect
hired at the
with-
time I was-
When was Mr. Kipp hired?
no, he wasn't here then.
He's here now.
No, I know, but he was not here when I was negotiating and developing.
Have you spoken to Mr. Kipp since?
On this issue, no.
Don't you think consulting with the town forester would be valuable in terms of developing the whole range of testimony and ideas you've presented here?
Well, as I noted, again, this entire plan of action, the deer fencing, et cetera, that you see up there was negotiated before he started and finalized. Remember, it would not be much.
You mentioned Project Wild. That was a project for teaching school children, isn't that correct?
Teachers. High
Sorry,
school.
right,
The curriculum was
teachers.
For students, my job was to teach teachers.
Right, so you taught teachers who taught school children about what exactly?
In the Project Wild curriculum, that was wildlife management as developed by that plan, discussing, for example, and using wildlife ecology as a way to teach math by using carrying capacity.
So you're teaching, what grades were those children?
That was manual for K-12.
Now, what did you write your master's thesis on?
I did not, I did a master's on the interpretation, I had two things I did for a master's. There were two paths I could take. The first was called the Comprehensive Examination System, which I did take and obviously passed. The second was a thesis on the interpretation of a natural area, which was the Delaware and Hudson Canal in Port Jervis, New York, on natural interpretation of the site.
What does natural interpretation refer to?
Interpretation of natural areas, like you might see, when you go to a park, a national park, a ranger will give you interpretations of nature as a naturalist. It was my writing of helping to write the curriculum and study the park for that.
Now, the Learning Tree Project was also an educational program for school children in effect.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned you did a report during your master's degree program. When did you graduate in your master's degree program?
82.
82. Now, in terms of your professional experience, your resume from your website doesn't refer to anything dealing with forestry. Would you agree?
Correct, because I'm not a forest.
And it doesn't refer to anything dealing with any areas strike that. It refers to the following: sustainable solutions for commercial, institutional, and residential buildings. Am I correct?
Sounds correct. I have it in front of me. I'll trust you.
Development of environmentally friendly purchasing policies. Does that sound right?
Yes, it does, sorry.
Energy reduction strategies,
Yes,
LEED building practices,
yes,
recycling,
yes,
solid waste handling systems.
yes.
Oh.
It also refers to, I'll strike that. Now, it does say you have successfully negotiated with county government, New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection, New Jersey Attorney General's Office and New Jersey Board of Public Utilities on issues ranging from solid waste licensing to environmental and regulatory changes covering many areas of environmental concern. Do you have anything more specific to add to that rather broad statement?
You're more in the way of specifics. I don't have a way to answer that. I've been in business for nearly 30 years. I can't really remember everything I've ever negotiated with this.
Where in your CV that you published on your website does it refer to deer management or deer maintenance?
It does.
It does not. And where in your CV does it refer anywhere to holistic analysis of ecological settings?
Specific words, it doesn't state that, but the entire premise of the CV is to get to that point. It's to explain to a potential client that if they have an issue, we look at things holistically. We don't look at a specific item per se, unless that specific item has relevance to the holistic issue. For example, you will see the Weed Green building there, as you read. In Weed Green building, one of the things we look at, depending on the development that we are looking at, we will look at the plan. We will look at whether it's virgin land, vis-a-vis forest, or if it's brownfield. We will look at both. We will look at energy. We will look at water. We will look at runoff. We will look at stormwater. We will look at ways to reduce all of those. I have worked on projects where I've done the calculations to reduce stormwater from roof lines and how to meet certain standards for doing buildings, working with an engineer, of course.
Does it say anywhere, sorry, go ahead.
Okay.
Does it say anywhere in your CV that you actually do work in the area of analyzing forests, woodlands, or other natural settings?
No, it's not called that.
Now, tell us how you came to be involved in the negotiating committee that led to what we've generally referred to as the settlement agreement.
We're gonna stop right there. No settlement agreement here. We have an overlay zone. The planning board is involved in, sorry, it is a zone plan, not an overlay zone. We're not involved with settlement agreement. That is not for this board.
The witness spoke repeatedly of his participation in the negotiating committee that
Right.
led to the settlement agreement.
And I said
Cross-examination
last meeting,
follows.
We're not going through the settlement agreement. The zoning board, the planning board is involved with a IH1 zone, and I want to keep it with the IH1 zone. You have,
There's another issue also. I mean, if Mr. DeFeo was retained through attorney-client privilege communication, I don't know what in fact happened. I wasn't around at that point. Well, I was around. I just wasn't in West Orange. That really treads on attorney-client privilege communication.
Mr. DeFeo has not given the slightest shred of indication
The-
that anything he did involved any communications with
Settlement
attorneys.
negotiations are typically privileged and not evidentiary. So in terms of how he got to that point and what was said in the negotiating room, that's not.
Well,
what's
number
being
one, I
dealt
didn't
with
ask
here.
anything about what was said in the negotiating room at this point. Secondly, I don't necessarily accept the premise that all of that area is somehow privileged. No one's established
I'm
that.
not saying it's all privileged, but it's touching upon that area. And it's also far afield from what we're doing here, which
Well,
is to concentrate on the ordinance and whether they've satisfied the requirements under the ordinance.
Mr. DeFeo's testimony is quite broad and far-reaching. He also repeatedly analyzed he referred repeatedly, first of all, to his role on the negotiating committee. All I did was ask him how he came to be on that committee. I think I can go further.
okay, I think we can go with that, but that's it. Nothing about what was said in the committee meeting, because that's privileged.
Well, number one, this idea that it's somehow privileged, I don't know where it's coming from. Not every settlement negotiation in the world is privileged, especially when it involves the town and the developer, and it becomes part of a public submission. I haven't even asked about the settlement negotiation yet, so I think you're being perhaps overly zealous in protecting something I haven't touched yet.
I have to weigh in. May I,
Mr.
Mr.
Blocker.
Chairman? There was a mediation conducted through the court with a special master in a confidential mediation. There was pending litigation. That litigation was a litigation filed by the Township of West Orange seeking compliance with its third round Mount Laurel affordable housing obligation. Any communications in that room, it is the applicant's position, or any drafts of documents, anything that was not within the public domain remain privileged as part of settlement communications under Rule of Evidence 408.
The applicant wasn't even in the settlement negotiation, as far as I know. Well, I'll strike that. First of all, the settlement agreement I'm holding up right here. It has been publicly released.
That's
All-
right. That's the culmination of all those
I
negotiations.
really don't understand why I'm being interfered with at all at this stage. I asked a simple question. How did you come to be on the negotiating
And
committee?
Dr. Bagoff said, go ahead and ask that
you can-
question.
But I don't know why the constant statement is made, well, I'm not gonna let you go further. You don't even know where I'm going yet.
Okay, go there and we'll
Thank
see
you
what
very much.
happens.
Thank you. Mr.
I'll join
Mr.
you on the
DeFeo.
trip.
Mr. DeFeo, how did you come to be on the negotiating committee?
Maybe that was 6 years ago now. I received a call from the township attorney who said he wanted assistance in the
Okay.
process, and that was it.
And you participated in negotiations with whom?
You can answer that.
I would have met with West Essex Highlands representatives and with the township representatives.
Now, in the settlement agreement, there is a plan for let's strike that, sorry. The paragraph 2.5.4 headed trees. There's a reference to a tree study commissioned by the township, which is, quote, reflected in the tree study report of the DeFeo Associates, dated February 3rd, 2020. Are you familiar with that study?
Yes.
Have you presented that study to this board?
I want to take your representative.
That's January 6th. This is February 3rd, 2020. Is it attached to that?
I don't have my entire file with me. Whatever I did submit to the planning board is posted on the website. I have to look.
Well, as far as I know, I'm unaware of ever seeing the February 3rd, 2020 tree study. Do you have that in your possession in some way? Not here necessarily, but do you have access to it?
To see if it was submitted. I did submit as of this week or last week, the original basis, which is what I was asked for in the last meeting, was the very original study upon which my report was predicated, and that was submitted and posted.
When was that posted?
That was part of my letter. I believe it didn't get up until yesterday because of the technical problems.
Right, this was part of the material you were going to post after the last meeting, yesterday.
Yes, because I couldn't get it posted before because of problems here.
Mr. Chairman, I'll have to note, I've not yet had a chance even to see it, so at some point there may be supplemental questions on that document. In addition, the Duke's Farm study, did you post that?
No, and as I posted in my supplemental report, there is a statement in there that very specifically says that what happened with the Duke Farm study is the fact that I referenced the Duke Farm study. The study was referenced in an article, and that was my reference to that because I personally interviewed people at Duke Farms, and I put the two together here rather than remembering that I had done the two separate. So what I did post, however, was an article that was published. I'll find that article, which you said you haven't seen. It's called The State We're In. It was written by the New Jersey Conservation Foundation. which highlights the statements I made from the Duke Farms study and also gives you a link, if you so choose, as anyone so chooses, I should say, if they'd like to see the entire workshop that was given at Duke Farms, about an hour-long workshop on deer management, which is there for the taking. The reference that I give you in Regenerating Native Forests to Fight Climate Change, the statements, the summary, and a very short summary, I'll grant you, of the Duke Farm study is presented, and that article was authored by Allison Mitchell, John Watson, Tom Gilbert, Michelle Byers.
Well, Mr. Chairman, a representation was made at the last meeting that study would be posted. Members of the public asked about it. The representation was made. I would ask that Mr. DeFeo post it, so at least in connection with an upcoming meeting, we all have access to it. Is there any technical reason, Mr. DeFeo, why that can't be done?
Okay, so this is an online study that anybody can find right now.
The webinar is online. Anybody can find it. It's public. The article that I submitted as part of my supplemental report shows the link, so the link can be taken and highlighted.
Mr. DeFeo plainly relied on the Duke's Farm study as part of his testimony. That's why it was asked to be posted. We shouldn't have to go finding it. The gentleman should post it.
Oh, this is not a court of law with strict rules of evidence. So
This is not a very strict request. He said he would post it, and for some
and
reason
he
it's not.
gave you access to that. And
Yesterday, the day before we're here to prepare, do cross-examination, it was supposed to have been posted promptly, so there'd be time to use it and study it.
1 minute.
Sure.
Mr. Efron, we're going to ask Mr. DeFeo to come back to the next meeting so you can question on that specific document only. You can continue questioning now.
Well, the documents that he posted yesterday, we need to question on, plus the missing document.
Yes,
Thank you.
you got it.
Thank you very
And we're
much.
going to focus on that next time.
That'd be
We're
fine.
not going to expand.
That's fine.
Please.
Absolutely.
Thank you. One moment, Mr. DeFeo.
Just to be clear, the work that was done by Duke Farms is a video conference. That's the study that was recorded. So I don't know what to do other than to give you the link to the video conference.
Fair enough.
As I stated in my secondary letter dated November 6th, which unfortunately we had trouble posting, that I had stated that I had interviewed the people at Duke Farms to draw some of my conclusions, discussing the study with them. I was inaccurate in my last testimony, and I corrected that, inaccurate in saying I have put the two together. I've seen the video, I've talked to the people at Duke Farms, I've read the article and read other deer studies. I don't have a specific written Duke Farms study to give you. It's a video.
Well, that does
That's
clarify.
posted.
Clarify, Mr. Chairman, but last week the representation was a study. That's why I asked. If you can just post the link, at least that'll be helpful.
It is posted.
Great, thank you.
Okay.
Now, in section 2.5.4 of the settlement agreement, it references the following. The township and we recognize the importance of preserving and or optimizing the regeneration of the forest in connection with the development of the subject property, but also recognize that the township's tree protection and removal ordinance, ordinance section 25-7, close parenthesis, the tree ordinance, close parenthesis, if applied to the proposed development, would constitute a cost generative requirement contrary to section 2.5.3 of this agreement. Now, is it fair to say that this is referring to the cost of replacing those 6,000 plus trees under the ordinary tree ordinance?
I'm going to object. The settlement agreement speaks for itself. It was a negotiated term and it was made part of the zoning ordinance, that particular provision.
I'm going to say, we're going to stay out of anything negotiated and stick with the ordinance. Whatever is in the ordinance, that's what we're going to follow.
Well, I'm asking if, in fact, the language I just quoted is referring to what would be the cost of replacing the trees under the ordinance. Mr. DeFeo was a consultant to the committee. He's obviously familiar with this, and it's a proper question.
I
Mr.
think
Ms.
he's
McGowan.
getting past his expertise. He's not here to interpret the settlement agreement.
To the
He's here-
contrary, he spoke very clearly about the costs of deer fencing versus other measures.
He's
And
not here to interpret this document. The document is a negotiated document prepared by attorneys, reviewed by the parties, and agreed to by the
well, let me
parties.
ask a question. What role, Mr. DeFeo, did you play in preparing the settlement agreement?
I'm going to object and just say for the record, Mr. DeFeo did not prepare the settlement agreement.
I don't know what Mr. DeFeo did or did not. I don't know how Mr. Plucker knows that.
Mr. DeFeo, did you prepare the settlement agreement?
I did not.
Did you contribute to any of the items in the settlement agreement?
Again, I think his testimony is clear, and I'm not going to answer for him, but we're not going to go into the negotiation that took place that resulted in this document.
Mr. DeFeo, who came up with the idea of deer fencing in this agreement?
That's fair. I'll go with
Thank
that. Okay, that's
I-
fair.
And is it fair to say that you came up with that as a replacement for the cost of replacing trees that the developer would otherwise have to bear?
Not exactly as you stated. It came in as an alternative because if it's allowable.
Well, I think Mr. DeFeo, with all due respect, I'm just going to stop you there, object.
Yeah, you can't stop them. Okay.
I can continue talking without interruption too, so
Certainly
I'd
you
like
can.
to do that. I think Mr. DeFeo was going to go and start to refer to possible discussions that may have been had during the negotiations. So I would just ask him to tread carefully in that area.
I don't know why we're treading so carefully. What's in here is a public document.
And-
It was released to the public. It forms the substantive basis of why Mr. DeFeo was here.
That's right. However, what was on the table, what got taken off the table, what got changed, that part is not in this document.
It says specifically.
And that part is not going to be discussed here because those were settlement discussions that are privileged communication.
You don't know that, Ms.
I
McGovern,
do
with due
know
respect.
that. I know that all settlement discussions on any cases in litigation, they're not evidentiary.
I, number one, didn't ask about settlement discussions per se. Number two, I reject the premise you've raised that a settlement discussion, a settlement document released to the public is so subject to privilege, the questions about it can't even be asked in public. There's no basis for this.
that's
There's
not-
no basis
I'm
for
gonna say
blocking.
the basis is the planning board was not part of it says it clearly in the document. The planning board was not part of the settlement agreement. We have nothing to do with the settlement agreement.
You
The-
do have
the-
something to do
the
with it, with
zone-
respect.
The zone was adopted into the master plan, and the board's responsibility is the zone in the master plan. So anything that travels from the settlement agreement into the master plan, we can refer into the
Ordinance,
IH one zone,
ordinance.
we can talk about it. As long as it belongs in the IH one zone, we can talk about it.
This witness retained by the board to be here repeatedly referred to the virtues of this settlement proposal because the developer agreed to pay for deer fencing, which he says is such a miraculous occurrence, he's never even heard of it before happening. So the question of the,
Okay, let's not, he didn't say miraculous.
I'm being an advocate.
Okay,
Yes.
and this is wonderful, but let's focus on the IH one zone. Those things traveled into the IH one zone.
Well,
That's
then
how
they're
you-
there anyway.
Excuse me?
Then they're there already.
It's
If it
there.
traveled into it, it's relevant.
As long as it's in the zone, that's what we're gonna discuss.
Ms. Bagov, I must point out, the witness repeatedly said how favorable this is because the developer is willing to pay the high cost of this deer fencing. It's entirely proper for me to ask, is this proposal in place of the otherwise very high cost the developer would have to pay to replace the trees?
And he did testify to that. I'll let him answer that.
Well,
because
that's
he
what I
did-
asked.
That you can testify to,
That's all I asked.
and that's what we're gonna go.
Good.
Thank you.
We've reached consensus. Do you remember the question?
The simple fact is that the deer fence, if the applicant simply did a tree replacement plan, the odds are better than even that those trees would simply have been destroyed by the deer. The idea of the deer fencing was in lieu of simply planting lots and lots of trees, which would probably not survive, and in my experience don't survive. The fact is, the deer fencing would help to regenerate the forest at a better rate and make for a healthier forest. So it was a discussion of how much deer fencing could we get the developer, and could we get regenerated forests? Deer fencing will lead to a healthier forest with greater undergrowth than planting trees.
Wasn't it a fact that the deer fencing was raised in substantial part because of the extremely high cost of replacing the trees under the ordinance?
I'm going to object. The settlement agreement references that. It speaks for itself. It references another provision. My client is providing a substantial set aside of affordable units. Under the Mount Laurel Doctrine and its progeny, an inclusionary developer represents a protected class of individuals in need of the housing. The regulations applicable to an inclusionary developer, to the court settlement, and even to this board talk about the reduction of cost generative items. And it also talks about other things. And we, like Mr. Affron likes to say, oh, well, the board is not bound by the settlement agreement. But the settlement agreement does reference certain regulations in that an inclusionary developer, applications are looked on more favorably, inferences are made. The applicable regulations encourage the free granting of variances, waivers, relief to make inclusionary developments happen. So to the extent things like that are in the settlement agreement, yes. And I believe Mr. Affron read the provision. It does reference. I think you can be easily inferred from this agreement that there was a cost generative item with compliance, strict compliance with the tree ordinance. So a combination of that combined with what Mr. DeFeo testified to is reflected in the settlement agreement.
Well, then if it's reflected in the settlement agreement, then my question is perfectly relevant.
What's the question?
I think the question is,
Is it, Mr. Efron, is the question which I believe was testified to, let's just be clear here. Is would the deer fencing give greater longevity to the forest at whatever cost, as opposed to just replanting trees? In your professional opinion, would replanting trees get the same result as the deer fencing would? Is that the question?
It's a
Mr.
lovely question, but it's not what I asked.
Ask your question again. I want to understand.
I asked, isn't it a fact that the deer fencing proposal was raised in order to free the developer of the extremely high cost of replacing trees under the ordinance?
I think he's given several reasons why he suggested deer fencing. I don't know that
understand,
that's
Ms.
the
McGovern,
exclusive,
why
but
I don't mean to be rude or anything. Why are you interjecting? It's a straightforward
He's-
question.
I don't know that he has the expertise to answer that specific question about cost.
He
gave
has the
reasons
expertise
for it.
to answer what he heard and what was traded back and forth. That's the point
And
of the
that's
question.
exactly what you're asking for, is what went on in the back room, trading back and
I'm not
forth.
asking for what went on in the back room.
Yes.
Mr. Parker already helped us out greatly by admitting that the alternative of replacing the trees by cost was referenced in the settlement agreement. Therefore, it's a relevant question to ask him. Isn't it a fact that the deer fence proposal was raised to free the developer of the very high cost of replacing trees under the ordinance?
Yeah, I object to the form of that question. I know this is not a deposition, but that is a very loaded question with a lot of characterizations.
Cross-examination, we're not here to serve tea.
We're not going to raise our
And
voices here, guys.
we're also not in trial. Mr. DeFeo, I think that's okay for you to answer the question.
Yes, if you have the information that is not privileged.
Wait a second. It's a straightforward question. It relates directly to the relevant statements made in the settlement. All of these directions, if you have the information, if it's not privileged, are really carving out answers from the witness. He should answer naturally on his own.
Can you answer, Mr. DeFeo?
I'm not certain I can answer the question exactly as asked. I can say, however, asked several different ways. What I can say is deer fencing is an alternative to the replacement of trees, both of which have a cost. In my opinion, the deer fencing is a more effective use of money from the developer. I did not, I can't answer whether it's $1 for $1 saved. I think that answers the question, but I don't know.
My question as asked stands, is that the answer you're giving, Mr. DeFeo?
That's the answer I can give you.
You mentioned that if trees were replaced, they'd be eaten by the deer and wouldn't get anything out of it anyway. That's a summary of what you said, right?
Not exactly, but I said that if trees were simply replaced with trees, which of course would be small trees relatively speaking, that there's a good chance that those trees might not survive. With deer fencing, the natural reseeding of the forest and the natural growth of seedlings have a much higher probability of survival.
You said that in the area of disturbance, there could be native plants planted by the developer, correct?
The developer is limited to using native plants in the area of disturbance, in their landscaping plan, to be more specific.
And you said, well, that'll help potentially reseed areas with native plants.
Correct.
Now, deer eat native plants, right? So when the developer is going to put these native plants in the landscaping plan, in the unfenced area where the deer will congregate, won't the deer eat those native plants?
First, you're making several presumptions. One, that the deer are going to immediately congregate just in the paved areas of the property, which is unlikely. They will certainly come there.
Don't deer walk down sidewalks, streets all over town? Okay, so why do you think they won't go to plants in the paved areas?
What I'm saying is the deer can in fact go to the landscape area. There are precautions that the developer can take with the trees that they plant in that area because they are limited in number. There are a number of protective measures they can take for those young trees. For the other plantings, shrubs, etc., and flowers and plants, as I specified on several occasions, they can use a deer repellent system. And that repellent system can be applied on a regular schedule if they so choose. It really is their call. I can't say what they would do, but if I was investing that kind of money in planting, I might consider investing in a monthly repellent system, which will significantly reduce deer crowds. It does not eliminate it, but it can significantly reduce it. They can also use small limited fencing criteria around areas that they have congregated. A mild deer fencing light, but basically small fencing, which you've probably all seen around plants in certain areas. Any combination of their actions will help to reduce the damage to their horticultural plantings.
Is there presently a landscape plan that you've seen that contains deer repellent measures?
Landscape plans would not include.
Are you aware of any deer repellent measures the developer has yet committed to?
Again, nothing in the plan with reference that. I am simply answering your question, is can plantings be protected? The answer is yes, they can be, but it is not part of the application.
Thank you. That answers my question, actually. Thank you. Now, it's fair to say that you proposed the deer fencing plan, correct?
No.
Who proposed the deer fencing plan?
I proposed the concept of deer fencing. The plan was ultimately developed by the planner.
But the idea of the deer fence as a measure, a remedial measure, for lack of a better word, came from you initially. Is that correct?
I think the concept, yes, I can safely say the concept was mine, yes.
Okay. Now, let me ask you a question. Looking at the site as it is today, not the developed site that appears in SP 11 on the screen, what proportion of this 120 acre forest is core or interior forest versus edge?
I've not done that calculation. I can't answer it.
Thank you. What is the effect of creating an edge in the interior of the forest on the health of the forest?
I'm not quite sure what you're asking, but could you clarify? If you're asking what is an edge zone, is that what you're asking?
Well, why don't you start off by saying what you understand in the question? What is an edge zone?
If you're asking what an edge zone is, an edge zone is the border between a forested area and an unforested area, typically developed by grasslands or non-trees. Best way would be to show you a picture, I presume. Sorry, I don't remember where all the pictures are. All right, so if you look in this image, for example, now this is showing you what a protected area and unprotected area would look like. And by the way, it goes to an earlier question, there is growth in forest after 9 years. This area right here would effectively be what you would call an edge zone. It's an edge between a forested and unforested area.
Now, you can also create edge zones artificially by clear cutting 27 acres in the interior of a forest. Isn't that correct?
Create an edge zone by creating anywhere where there's a forested area meeting an unforested area. West Essex, the development below is an edge zone all along this developed area. Where all these homes are is an edge zone, where all these homes already exist is an edge zone. This is an edge zone.
Now, when you create the area of disturbance in the center of SP 11, along with any roads that connect, have you calculated how many feet or miles of edge zone are being created in the interior of this forest?
No,
Why not?
unnecessary for the purposes that I was retaining.
Well, what were those purposes in your understanding?
We develop this site in the best way possible for the environment.
And don't you think that examining how much new edge zone is being created in the interior of this forest would be relevant to the health of this environment?
Based on this plan, no.
Would you agree that edge zones create areas of forest degradation beginning at the point of the edge and going into the interior?
Edge zones inherently are not damaging to the interior of the forest. Edge zones are created naturally every time a tree falls or a forested area is damaged. So I wouldn't necessarily agree with that. I would agree, of course, where there's disturbance, the area of disturbance, the area outside in this context here, you see you have a road here. And as I testified already, certainly when I cut this road, I've already testified that any trees along the very outside edge here may in fact be impacted negatively by that because of their roots being cut. How far in that would go? It depends on the depth, but most likely no more than 1 or 2 trees in. It's not going to go very far in the forest.
Is it a fact that most foresters and people who work in this field believe that an edge zone generally incorporates 300 feet from the edge to the interior?
Answer from those forests.
Are you familiar with this concept?
I believe the forest is having a concept of of buffers and impacts that go beyond the roads that they cut the forest and lots.
Do you know
I
how
have not
far?
specifically analyzed it for this particular project.
Well, wouldn't it be relevant if edge zones can damage the interior of a forest to determine how deep the edge will be from the area of disturbance in order to figure out how much forest is going to be left?
No, you're oversimplifying this pretty badly. What this would do, the indication or the implication you're making is that the developed area is going to somehow have an impact that this is not the scale, I can't give you the scale, but is going to negatively kill an entire area out here. There's no presumption for that. The fact is that the developer will have someone on site retained by the township to ensure that minimum damage is done to this area. In terms of it expanding out, the area will be will be fenced off or marked off so that equipment is limited in its impact. Absolutely, there will be an impact. Anytime you disturb land, you have an impact. There's no argument about that.
Are you in a position as a professional or expert to discuss the depth of impact on the surrounding woods that is caused by the creation of new edge?
I would not make a comment to that in this, not analyze.
And you have the expertise to provide a professional answer to my question if you had analyzed it.
I would have consulted with my foresters and I would have come up with an answer if I was asking, but I don't need to see this impact.
Is it fair to say that it's the foresters who would have the expertise to answer this question?
Foresters would have expertise in general impact. They don't necessarily know the specific site, but they can use general knowledge.
Is it fair to say that as compared to you, it's the forester who would have the expertise to address the issue of damage caused by creating new edge in the interior of the forest?
I don't know that a forester would have any more knowledge of that compared to an environmental scientist, but they would have looked at it more often, certainly.
But you agree you don't have that expertise yourself?
I haven't looked at it. So I can't answer the question because I haven't looked specifically to give you that answer. I would understand the studies, I would be able to read the analysis and certainly report on it, but I didn't in this case.
All right, so in any event, you're not able to answer the question because you didn't do that analysis.
Right.
Okay, thank you. Now, I just want to go back for one moment. You referred to your academic work, taking some courses in forestry or teaching some students, and you did report. I forgot what year you graduated your master's program. I'm sorry.
My undergraduate was 1980, my graduate was 82.
Okay, thank you. Now, in your report, make a statement. Let's go back. It was mostly an answer to questions from the public that you made the following statement, as I recall. You compared photographs for this forest going back a certain number of years. And you indicated there's been no change in the tree canopy in that span of time. Do you recall those general answers?
Generally, yes, we go to the slides that were up here.
Yeah, and they went back, I think, about 30 years, those slides, right?
Two years.
Now, in this 22-year period, you testified that you did not observe any death, D-E-A-T-H, death of tree canopy of any substance in the different photographs that we saw. Is that correct?
What I testified to is based on my general observations, I don't see any major impact. But that's what I testified to, not specifically. And as I pointed out in this testimony of these three particular images, this is just meant to show an overview of the site. Had I gone back further, and I do have, there is an old photograph, really not very good, very hard to see, from 1985, when the entire area here was wooded. It
No,
was
we understand.
contiguous woodland.
No, we understand that.
So
That
the
was
point is, the
built.
forest has changed, but the change here, as you can see, not well, I'm afraid, is limited. And that's all I was trying to use these images to show.
So there's been essentially in this 22-year period, and perhaps even going back further, this stretch of forest is essentially stable. Is that fair to say?
Stagnant would be a better word.
Stagnant. In other words, the level of tree density, the tree canopy, all of that is essentially the same over this period of time. Is that right?
It is a stagnant forest, yes, that's a good way to put it.
Essentially, my question was a little bit different. Essentially, you mean that the tree canopy, the extent of woodlands, the density of trees, et cetera, is all essentially the same throughout this 22-year period.
Correct, stagnant.
Thank you.
It's not evolved as it should.
Well, that's perhaps another issue. I simply wanted to ask that limited question right now. Now, in your report, you make a statement at page 2. The forest consists primarily of large trees. The initial study showed no trees under 4 inches in diameter within the study plots. Would you just take us to the slide that shows the study plots? I want to just identify that. It's not easy to see, but there are circles, right?
Okay.
That's better. Thank you. Perfect. Thank you. In that slide, roughly in the center and a little bit, well, it looks like there's a kind of fold down the center of the picture. And on both sides of the fold, there are some circles. You see that?
Are you talking about this line here?
Yeah, it looks like a fold line of some sort
Okay.
from an old document. And there are circle lines on both sides of it. Are those the study sites?
Those are study plots, yes.
And those are the study plots that you refer to on page 2 of your report.
Yes, it's finding in those particular study plots, we did not find any trees below 4 inches in diameter in the initial study in 2019.
Now, just for reference, I'm referring when I say report to the October 16th, 2024 report that Mr. DeFeo submitted. Well, you say though, that in August of 2024, you did find small stands of trees ranging from 1 to 2 inches.
Correct, that was a non-statistical walkthrough study.
Now, so in fact, you do show trees under 4 inches, don't you?
No, the study that was done in, this study does not find any trees under 4 inches. Can you reduce that? Yeah. Yeah, this is from the original tree study. This is a statistical analysis.
Hang on, before you go further, that's referring to the blue bar graphs, which also has the word histogram, is that correct?
That's correct.
Right, Mr. Chairman, hang on 1 second, please. Mr. Chairman, for reference, there are no page numbers, so I'm going to, at points, describe the slides so we have a reference. Now, when I say histogram page, you would understand I'm referring to the blue bar graph page, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Now, in that page, it begins the blue bar graph at 4 inches in diameter, is that correct?
Correct.
Now, you said at the last meeting that there was no study made of trees below 4 inches because they're not counted. Is that what you said?
They were not counted in the study, nor were they found.
Well, wait,
There's observational work within the tree report and there's statistical work.
now what year was this? I'm sorry.
The 2019 study. This is the original study. This is the only statistical analysis. Because everything, obviously, if you think of the year, this was relevant in 2019. Statistically, we did not find it. In observational walkthrough, we did find some saplings and seedlings growing. Not many, but we found them, and I was very pleased to see them.
Where did you document these saplings growing? No, do you have a map showing where they were growing?
No, as I said, the 2024 walkthrough was not a statistical analysis because the statistical analysis was designed to look at the area of the disturbance fundamentally. I can't tell you that when we saw the seedlings in our secondary walkthrough, that they were absolutely in the area of disturbance.
Well, do you have any ability to tell us where these stands of trees that showed trees 1 to 2 inches were found?
As I stated, we did an observational, non-statistical analysis. We walked through.
So
If I walked through today, I could find them again, probably because I would stumble on them as we did the first time. Sorry.
Do you have any notes showing where you found those?
No. It was an observational walkthrough, which is a simple, non-statistical, subjective, observational note saying we saw them.
And we have no ability to know where they are on the site.
Specifically, not from what I did, no.
And we have no ability to know how widely distributed these stands of trees were based on what you presented.
Based on our observational walkthrough, we saw very few stands of young trees, which is why in the 2019 study, we found none.
Well, actually, that's not what you say in your report. You say you found small stands of trees ranging from 1 to 2 inches.
That's in the 2024 non-statistical, non-analytical walkthrough, subjective walkthrough.
You don't say there were very few. You just say you found small stands of trees ranging from 1 to 2 inches. Isn't that correct?
I'll clarify to you that what I mean by that is there were very few.
So in other words, as an environmental scientist, you clarify orally after you're cross-examined, but you don't put your specific findings in the report? Is that what you're saying?
Right, again, the 2019 study is the statistical analysis and what I stand by. The 2024 walkthrough was people asking, has the forest changed? In my opinion, it has not changed. In the forest's opinion that I took with me, it has not changed. The forest is not regenerated. Might there be the odd small tree growing? Might there even be 100 odd small trees growing? The answer is yes, there could be. And in fact, there might be 150. That does not make a healthy forest.
Do we have any ability?
My conclusion, not the specifics of the number of trees and where they are. The specific finding is this a healthy forest? The answer is No, on a long-term basis, this is a stagnant forest, as you pointed out. And it is a forest that is not evolving properly as it should because of excessive deer grounds.
And we only have your word to say because you didn't provide any notes of these observations of the smaller trees. Isn't that correct?
You have my word, I'm under oath, and I'm telling you the truth.
How come you have a documentation of very specific numbers on the histogram beginning at 4 inches, but you don't have any documentation of the smaller trees that you observed?
As I testified to, this histogram is from the 2019 statistical analysis performed on the property. The note referencing the small saplings and seedlings is from a 2024 walkthrough of the property, which was requested by this board, that I go back and see that property, where it is a subjective, non-statistical analysis.
You've answered my question as best you can, I suppose. Is that fair to say?
I've answered your question accurately.
Now you say, also on page 2, with limited exception, the trees observed were as large as 24 to 36 inch diameter at breast height. That's on page 2 of the study. Do you recall that line?
Which are,
It's on the
what do you mean
section-
the date report?
On page 2 of the October 16th report,
Okay,
item 3A, small I.
yes, I see that.
Right, it says with limited exception, the trees observed were as large as 24 to 36 inch diameter at breast height. Now, when were those trees observed in that way? In the 2019 study for the histogram?
No, that particular area, well, that's from both. That's from the 2019 study where we looked at measured trees and to the 2024 where I just did general observations.
So what you're saying in Roman numeral I there is that with very limited exception, the trees were large in the 24 to 36 inch range. Is that correct?
In what we observed on 2020, right?
Well, let's look at the histogram that's on the screen. If we could zoom in on it a little bit without losing too much of the text.
I don't know how to do that.
That's a little better. I have trouble seeing that. Good, perfect, thank you. Well, what we actually see on this histogram is the exact opposite of what you just read from your report. Because the histogram shows virtually no trees from 24 inches and higher, and a heck of a lot of trees in the smaller ranges, 4 inches, 8 inches, 12 inches, etc. Now, how do you explain this discrepancy between the statistical analysis in the histogram and your report where you said virtually all the trees were in this high range when there are none shown virtually in the histogram?
Because we were looking for large trees and when we did our non-statistical analysis. So we were looking at the biggest trees in the area. The 4 to 8 to 12 inch, I would point out to you, 8, 12 and 16 inch diameter trees are not small trees. What we were noting is there are a number of larger trees that we were walking through and saying, hey, there are a number of larger trees here that we can observe. We did not count them, which is why in the October 16 report, one of the recommendations, I should say, I'm sorry, that we made was that we do an additional study to try to identify some of the larger trees in the area of disturbance to see if they could be preserved. Now, we don't know that we can because we haven't plotted them with the GPS system. And so we plot them within a meter or so. We will know, for example, the 36 inch tree that we saw that we say, hey, we'd love to say this large oak, for example, is it in the middle of brick buildings? I can't say with any certainty. So the reason that is in there is to support the recommendation, which I made to the board, that we ask the applicant to allow us to go forth with that GPS study, which would then identify trees of note that we think we might be able to save, if at all.
Can we go back to my question, please? No, you're talking about large trees in the area of disturbance that could be identified as specimens. I didn't get to that yet. I'm asking you very simply, why is it that your report says that with limited exception, the trees observed were in the 24 to 36 inch category, and your histogram shows the exact opposite?
Let me try to clarify again. That statement is based on a walkthrough of the area we were looking for large trees. That was inarticulate in the way I worded that paragraph. I should probably have done it better. But it is to state that when we walked through, we were looking for bigger trees and we found bigger trees because we looked at them. It is not a statistical analysis. It is not meant to compare to something that was done in a very rigid, statistically valid method. That statement is subject,
But it would seem to me that.
and they would not necessarily match.
Well, it seems to me that a rigid statistical scientific method would be more reliable than a visual that you do when you casually walk through. Isn't that fair to say?
That's fair to say, which
Well, then
also
doesn't-
supports the conclusion that the forest is stagnant and therefore needs to be protected.
Well, it seems to me that if your histogram, which is the scientifically rigid study, shows mostly smaller trees, 4, 8, 12 inches, and almost no larger trees, that would be more reliable than what you say at page 2, 3AI of your report.
They're conflating information. I can't answer a question that's got conflated data. I'm trying to explain that, but I apparently am not successful.
With respect, it's your data. I'm not conflating data. I'm not making it up. It's yours.
You're interpreting differently than what I wrote. I have stated what I wrote and what it means.
Now, you
I'll do it
say.
again if you like, but it's what
No,
it
it's not
says
necessary.
is.
We can move on. You said what you had to say. We can move on to the point unless you have something new on that point to offer.
Yeah.
Now, you say you were looking for large trees when you did that walkthrough. But when you did the histogram, you weren't looking for large trees? I'm trying to understand this. Well, that it sounds like that, and I'm trying to understand what you mean.
The scientific survey. When you're doing a tree survey, you're looking for what's there. And you do so in a statistically valid method using a statistically valid pre-survey methodology. For example, it states that you will use a GPS locator, you will use GIS, you will locate your study plots within a specific area. That is what you were assigned to do. It says further that the study plots must be of a specific size. They're 100 square feet, actually statistically 10 by 10. You also look at, and you do counts, you do identifications, you then subject all of that to a statistical analysis. What I stated about the trees when we walked through in 2024, which again is a request, and I don't know which meeting, forgive me for not remembering that. It was, can you please walk through and see if the forest has changed? In that discussion, in that walkthrough, we decided to walk, again, subjectively. Hey, are there any large trees here that are worth saving? Let's start looking at the larger trees and see if there are some things here. We might have some nice specimen trees. Let's see if we can work with the developer later and save some of these specimen trees, which would be to everybody's benefit if they can be saved. So the secondary component is subjective and not a statistically meritorious analysis. It is my professional opinion based on observations in the field, which scientifically observations in the field have value. Can I support those observations with statistical analysis? I cannot.
Would you agree that the state of deer browse on our forests has been essentially the same since the early 1990s? Why can't you answer? You're a biological environmental scientist. I thought you had knowledge in these
About this
fields.
forest? I wasn't here looking at it.
No, I'm asking in general, is deer browse in our forests essentially the same over this period of time?
Deer browse has gotten worse since 1990.
Well, are you in a position to state the extent of change in deer browse in our New Jersey forests, northern New Jersey, not the Pine Barrens, over this time period?
No, you would have to study a specific forest to do, you'd have to actually have a forest analysis, which I did. I had to my report in there for Essex County, where they very specifically hire someone to go out and do a survey of deer population with various recommendations on what to do with that population. Unless you do that, you can't determine specific numbers. No.
Have you done that with this forest? Now, let's go back to the study map if you can. I don't know which frame it is.
When you said studying that.
The one with the circles. That,
This one.
yeah, I think you can enlarge a little bit. Okay. Now, who chose these study plot locations?
Amy Green Environmental, who did the work for me.
Right. You don't mean Amy,
Done.
you don't mean Amy Green, but you mean her company. She sold it, but, right, okay.
Not her, I don't know her personally, and she was there.
Right. No, I think she
I
sold the
was,
company.
but she was.
I'm just clarifying. It's the company that did
Still
that.
owns the company.
Now, the foresters or arborists you work with chose those sites. Is that correct?
It's selected through using a statistical analysis methodology, using GIS and plotting surveys. It's a
Well-
randomized study.
Wait,
No one went out and said, give me a circle right here because I want to see that circle. As I've testified before, this is a randomized study. That's what you do to make it statistically valid.
Well, wait a minute. It's not randomized. You only focused on the area of disturbance. Isn't that correct?
Correct.
Okay. And it seems like so who decided which particular study plots on this map would be examined?
The foresters
Okay.
in the field.
They decided where to look and study in these different locations.
They were charged, as I was, to look at the area of disturbance as we knew it. And to develop the study methodology for randomized plotting in the area of disturbance, which is what they did.
Why didn't you do study plots in other parts of the forest aside from the area of disturbance?
The primary concern was to determine the area of disturbance and the impact that development would have on that area, because the rest of the forest was not being disturbed.
But you're using the results from these circled areas to discuss the health of the entire forest, aren't you?
No, I'm using the results of these circled areas to discuss the statistical number of trees in the forest.
Well, didn't you tell us that, let me go ask you another question. How much of this forest did you actually look at yourself?
So I walked every inch of that.
Every inch of the forest?
No, let me be specific. I haven't crawled across it, but I've walked the perimeter of the forest, edge to edge, top to bottom.
You've walked the perimeter around the
A
forest?
perimeter, I've walked through it, I've crossed it,
Do you have,
I've walked in different areas, I've walked up and down, in the areas, except for the wetlands.
do you have notes of where you walked, what you observed, what sections?
Any of my, anything I've seen is observed and in the report.
So you have no other notes or records showing where you went on the forest aside from what you've just generally described?
No, other than the photographs I've submitted in part of this.
Wouldn't a scientist who's doing a field survey keep some sort of notes of the work they've done and the places they've observed things on the property?
I took photographs.
Well, you gave us one photograph, if I'm correct. Would you turn to
There are
that?
multiple, there are other reports that have been submitted over the years, but
Well, that's
I
not
have
before
hundreds
the,
of photographs, if that's the question, but the presentation that was done, well, that's not relevant to this. The slides that I've shown here, I think it's this presentation, I think it's my prior report, forgive me.
well, that report's not here. The question I'm asking is how many,
The one I submitted, I'm sorry, the one I submitted originally, I think.
The July one?
I think it's July. Thank you. Thank you, because I can't remember the dates.
Yeah, I have,
it's part of the record.
there's a July 1. And there's a October 16.
But I think to answer your question succinctly, no, I don't have a study log or a notebook log, if that's what you're asking.
Now, the people from Amy Green Environmental who did the study plots and did this work, did they keep such records for the studies they did?
I have no idea. They submitted a report.
You didn't even ask to see their underlying notes?
No. Yes, to the report.
Now, based on your testimony at the last meeting, there's one photograph of this forest that you took and put in this report. Is that correct?
I'm not certain of the question. I'm sorry.
You put one photograph from this forest into this report that's on the screen. Isn't that correct?
I think the only thing I can do here, yeah, here's the actual site.
Okay, so
I guess my presumption is, to answer your question, I want to look to make sure I'm accurate about it.
please take your time.
It looks to be correct. Yeah, the one picture was used for illustrative purposes only, yes. Not meant to be exhaustive.
Well, all photographs are for illustrative purposes. I'm simply asking, how many photographs of this site did you include in this report?
What, in this document, one.
Okay, now just scroll down a little so we can get an identification for the record of the slide. Thank you. That's the one
I can't
before.
control this, I'm sorry.
All right, there's a,
Which slide did you? I don't know. which
the one which has this, well, the photograph, it has two photographs, one in the lower left corner.
Hang on, Joe, I think I can get that.
That's it. Perfect. Leave it right like that. Thank you. That's a slide headed example of excessive deer browse. It contains two photographs, one on the right side, one on the left. Now, do I understand your testimony is that the one on the left is the photograph you took of this forest that we're talking about?
Yes, this is the actual site.
Okay.
I can tell by the chair.
All right. Now, there are no other photographs of the site that you've offered to the planning board. Is that correct?
No, because the only thing that I'm looking at here, what I'm trying to explain to the board is this is an example of a forest that demonstrates excessive deer browse. And as explained in prior testimony, when I can look through a forest with that kind of clarity, as I can in this other example of another forest, you can see I can look through here. What it shows is I have excessive deer browse because I have no understory.
For the record, the witness is pointing to the photograph on the right side of the slide.
Sorry.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
The left side is the actual site, the right side is the example photo. And as you can see, the point of these photographs, again, just for a simple example, is to show an unhealthy forest with excessive deer browse. You have very clear visibility through the forest.
Well, you're showing a photograph. Is it fair to say the foreground appears to be an area about 40 feet wide? Would that be fair to say?
I don't know.
Well, you took the picture. Do you have any idea how big a space this is?
No.
Well, it shows two trees. You can't tell us how wide the foreground of this photograph is?
I didn't measure it, I'd be guessing.
Well, you were there. Do you have an estimate of how large the scene was?
He said he
That's
doesn't know. Move on, please. He said he doesn't know. Move on.
I can press a little bit more.
He-
How far back does this actually, if you don't know the foreground's width, how can you say how far back we're looking in the background?
Did not give you an exact answer. I said, as I stated, I can see a brief distance. What that distance is, I did not measure, but it is comparable to this other forest. And then I tried to go.
Well, stick with my question, please. I'm just trying to get the dimension of the photograph.
The difference is that in a healthier forest, this is not this forest. There are 4 photographs here.
This is a slide that says what a healthier forest looks like.
Correct. And these 4 photographs, which were taken by me of another forest in New Jersey, and to be specific, Somerset County, New Jersey. A healthier forest, as you can see, looking through the aspect ratio is the same camera, so the aspect ratio is the same. And you can see, I can't see very well through this forest. The less you can see, the more undergrowth. The more undergrowth, the healthier the forest.
Mr. Fair, with respect, I'm not asking about another forest. So if we can go back to the prior slide. Thank you. Now, that slide, we're looking at that slide on the screen some distance. But when we look at the printed report, and you can look close up at your photograph, there's actually quite a large diversity of trees in the background of the slide.
Yes, nothing in my report is commenting on the diversity of speciation that.
Well, no, I don't mean speciation necessarily. I'm sure there is diversity of species there. I'm referring to the width of the trees. If you look at the background on the photograph, as opposed to the foreground, there are hundreds of trees represented of many different diameters according to the photo. Isn't that true?
Yes.
So didn't you choose a photograph intentionally showing an empty foreground just to illustrate your thesis of a dying forest?
There was no presumptive element in trying to make a point other than to show you if I took pictures throughout this forest, they would all have a similar type of depth and perception.
Well, I'm looking at this very picture in the printed out version of your report. And after the, first inch and a half is done, you can look at the back of it and you can see a vast number of trees, and many of them actually are of many different dimensions. So isn't it fair to say that the foreground does not represent accurately even this part of the forest?
No, your conclusion's incorrect.
Okay.
It's factually incorrect.
You would agree that a large forest is variable and has many different elements to it, doesn't it?
All forests are variable, like many different elements, yes.
So why on earth did you give us one single photograph of one small area of this forest to demonstrate your thesis that it's a forest that will not regenerate?
It is simply meant to demonstrate it by a single image to show and compare to others what you would see in an unhealthy forest.
But we have no way of knowing, do we, that the rest of the forest looks like the foreground here because you've offered no other photographs. Isn't that true?
I've offered my testimony to support that.
So we have your testimony supported by no notes or records and no photographs. Is that fair to say?
You have my testimony supported by my reports, which I think are now 3 or 4, and my testimony on at least three separate occasions.
And we have no documentary evidence other than that photograph and the histogram. Isn't that correct?
Documentary evidence is my report and the photographs contained and the tree study.
If this condition of the foreground is so widespread, why haven't you showed us photographs of different parts of the forest? Wouldn't that address the issue without leading to speculation and doubt? Wouldn't a scientist do that and document properly their thesis?
There's no need to show you multiple photographs to take up multiple space in a report of this nature, because in my professional opinion and in my professional observations, which I testified to and stated in my reports, this is essentially what the forest looks like. Most importantly, the specific identification of a specific area of the specific forest is irrelevant, because the overall conclusion of this forest shows that walking the forest, the only, as I testified to, the only undergrowth that is there typically, they say only, that's absolute. The majority of the undergrowth growing there is typically invasive species such as Japanese stiltgrass and barberry, which are non-native and also not wildlife habitat. And throughout the forest, there is a very strong lack of undergrowth.
And we have your word for that because there are no other photographs.
Indicates that the forest is overly browsed, which is supported by at least 2 documents that have been submitted as additional, per your request, I might add, for additional information showing studies, the most recent being the 2023 summary of the South Mountain Reservation study done by the Essex County Park System. And you will look in multiple documents, even up to and inclusive of the Association of New Jersey Environmental Commission's report on trees dated 2024. Every single report discusses the impact of excessive deer browse leading to a lack of understory growth. So there are multiple studies saying the same thing with different observations, and the different reports that I've submitted, you don't see any photographs in some cases. Some cases, it's a statement of the scientist's observations. I have given you my scientific observations and my scientific conclusions.
You have anything else to add in response to my question as to whether it would be a proper scientific act to document this report more thoroughly?
In my opinion, this report has been documented properly.
Did you consult any other tree studies on this property? Aside from the one that you had Amy Green do?
I'm not certain I understand the question.
Have any other tree studies been done on this property?
I don't know.
Did you ask the developer if they had done any?
I may have, but if I had, he didn't have them to the best of my knowledge.
Did you recall asking the developer if they had done a tree study on this property?
Again, my recollection is I probably would have, but I can't say this. But I do not have any other studies. Part of the answer, I believe.
The photograph that's on the screen, like on the slide, example of excessive deer browse.
Yeah.
Would you agree that actually reflects a trail or path that's been trod over the years?
No.
That, in your opinion, there's no evidence of a
There's no
trail?
trail. That is not a trail. There are trails on the property. That is not one.
Now, do you recall asking the developer if they had a tree study? Yes or no? Did you ask the developer?
My recollection is I did and there wasn't, but I can't speak to certain.
How many trees per acre do you calculate in your statistical discussion?
Using the analysis provided in the 2019 study, we did a calculation of 212 trees per acre.
And you based that on what was your analysis that led to the 212 figure
The statistical tree study performed in 2019.
as reflected on the histogram?
Never reflected in the tree study, which is posted.
But you didn't submit the tree study itself to the board, did you?
The board asked me for my report, which is what they obtained. Subsequently, the board asked for the original tree study, which I submitted.
And when did you post that?
As I said yesterday, our supplementals were able to go up yesterday because of problems we had last week.
I just want to clarify, Mr. Bagav asked me at the next time to focus on that. So that's one of those documents we will look at.
January 6, 2020.
I
Amy Green report.
don't remember the date offhand, but whatever the date of that 2020 study was. Now, the 212 figure comes from, is that an average from the study plots?
So, well, statistical analysis doesn't work quite that way.
Well, I'm asking-
You mean median mode, you do standard deviation of variance. It is the result of the conclusion of the original tree study that was done in the field. Additionally, although we did find different calculations of different densities in some areas, I picked the highest density of trees I testified to before in the original report to reflect the greatest potential loss of trees, which I testified to before, that might impact the developed site. In fact, the projection is there are probably fewer trees in that area because there may be some variation in density throughout. But we picked what we thought would be the worst possible outcome in the disturbed area to show the greatest possible impact on the tree.
How'd you get 212 per acre? What did you do to get that figure?
I used it, Amy Green provided me a statistical analysis, which you are free to read, which uses a methodology. If you'd like the methodology, it's called the Mueller, D'Amboise, and Eilenberg 1974 methodology to conduct a tree survey.
Okay, and that was based on the tree study in the study plots that we see on the other
Correct.
side.
Yes, correct. That tree density is based on that. That is correct.
And the data for that study, that conclusion of 212 came from those individual study plots.
It came from the entire study of that area and then a statistical analysis of that.
Right, but the study was in the plots itself,
The
correct?
study was the study area was in let me be, to show you the slide again, just so we're clear. Need vertical these days. There, that is the image that was provided as part of the tree study. And from the data collected in the study plots, I think this answers your question,
Yeah.
correct me if I'm wrong. Yes, those conclusions were drawn.
Right, the data came from the study plots, not the whole square where the plots were.
Correct.
Okay, thank you. I just want
Yeah,
to
correct.
clarify.
You don't count every tree.
Mr. Efron, I don't want to stop you on this roll, but can we take a 5-minute bio break? Is this?
I was
okay?
just checking my phone to see whether it was a good time. Yes. Thank you.
5 minutes.
It's so
Yeah, he had a microphone.
I said that coffee, so I'll be good for a minute.
Oh, yeah, we're over here.
Chairman Bagel. Many questions.
Thank you. No, this guy wants to get.
I wish I could take the train.
Okay, we'll wait till you get, Mike,
It's in Lawrence though, so there's no way to get down the train station. Working over Hamilton, but nobody go to use it. The person was over the Hamilton, right by the train station. I could have gone down, but they don't.
I need a minute.
Who's this guy here that's recording? He's. Thank you. But they're trying to get a better vote from Brobo. So that's his.
Wait, great, 2 minutes, we're just waiting for Mr. Efron to come back. Perfect, okay. We're back on the record.
Sorry. Meeting schedule.
December 11th, we talked about you for a special meeting.
Yeah. That's a key. I'll use my glasses this time.
Thank you.
December 11th. Yes. Okay. Okay. That's
Of
fine.
course.
Yes, okay. Mr. Efron, you have the
Chairman,
floor.
I understand we're going to break at 10 in terms of timing tonight, right?
I'm sorry?
We're breaking at 10 o'clock tonight in terms of
Yes, sir.
timing, I
Yes,
understand.
sir.
Okay.
10 o'clock.
We're done with that.
For tonight, yeah.
Thank you.
Great. This is the legal profession. We never end. That's it. We tried.
Are we going out for drinks after this?
With respect to, I had asked Mr. DeFeo about any earlier studies, tree studies done by the developer on this site. And in general, his answer was he was not aware of any, whether he recalled asking or not, he wasn't aware of any. We do have evidence of that nature, which in discussions with board counsel, we will supply the documentary record, there is this tree study that was filed with the board on this property on an earlier occasion. And we will submit that to Mr. Plaka, to the board, to Mr. DeFeo, so that it can be posted and so the board members can look at it beforehand. And I'll just note that that is a document that is part of another site plan proposal for this site. We are not submitting it for the site plan above that. We're submitting it for the tree study results that are on the bottom part of the document. And so we will submit that, but just when people see it, I don't want anyone to spend time studying the site plan on that. That's not really relevant here. What's relevant is this tree study that's on that document, and that's what we'll question Mr. DeFeo on at the next meeting.
Will you submit a letter to the board so that is posted also describing exactly what you said so nobody will be
Yes.
confused?
With pleasure.
Thank you.
It sounds like something that wasn't done by the.
I'm sorry, just need a moment. Mr. DeFeo, in terms of the undisturbed area, now strike that. In terms of the limits of disturbance or the disturbed area, as we see on SP 11, is there a survey identifying the specific species that are in the areas of disturbance that will be removed?
I'm sorry, you were talking about specific species of trees in that
Well,
area?
let me rephrase. I'm sorry. Let's get to, if we can get to SP
Oh,
11.
SP 11, I'm sorry. I had the wrong slide up for you.
Yeah, and if we can get it a little darker like we did before, it's difficult to actually see from here.
Should be 11,
Oh,
right?
thank you, that's much better.
Yeah, that's it, isn't it?
SP 11, that's
That's
SP
it.
11.
Yeah.
Yes. Now, I'm just putting this up just to illustrate the area of disturbance. Now, is there a survey of the different tree species that will be lost within the 27-acre clear cut that will comprise the area of disturbance?
We did not do an analysis by number of each species of tree. We did identify many of the species that were present, but not by saying there were 57 white oak and 32 of this or the other thing in the study area. What we did do is we surveyed the area and identified the fundamental number of trees that were in the, the fundamental types and species of trees that were there to verify that this was a mixed hardwood forest.
Did you do any analysis as to the diameter of specific species present in the area of disturbance?
No, we didn't look at a specific tree and say this white oak is 16 inches or 4 inches or something like that, no.
So we don't say a calculation of white oaks 24 inches and higher, white oaks 12 inches to 24 inches or anything like that?
Correct, that wasn't part of the parameters of the study.
Now, who set the parameters?
We set the parameters to calculate tree density, so I set those parameters. Identify the general species in the area to confirm the type of forest, and our concern was density and numbers of trees that would be lost. That's what we focused on.
Thank you. Now, in the undisturbed area on this site, that will not be fenced in relative to the surrounding neighborhood or the new buildings that will be built. Is that correct?
The undisturbed area will be comprised of two sections. The deer fenced area is undisturbed area. So there are two areas of undisturbed property. One is deer fenced here and here, approximately 33 acres. And the remaining undisturbed area, which is in green on this map, is just as it is today. It will be undisturbed and not taken out or cut down.
And when we say undisturbed, you mean it will be undisturbed by means of construction or engineering works?
That's correct.
Now, I appreciate the clarification. I was referring to the undisturbed area, not to the sides where the fencing will be, but to the undisturbed area that surrounds the area of disturbance. Now, that area will not be fenced in for deer protection. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So since deer are prevalent in the area and will be attracted to the woods, will be to a great degree concentrating the deer presence on the unfenced undisturbed area. Isn't that fair to say?
Well, it's presuming that the deer don't move. They will have less land to move within than they did before because of the deer fencing. So I can't say they're going to be concentrated. It's not as if they live here exclusively, but when they come into this area, they'll have less area they can walk through.
Well,
When you say concentration, you want to be clear and say, it's not like this whole area is fenced. Let me put it to you that way. If this entire property was simply fenced in with 8-foot fencing and we left the deer in here, then clearly they would be confined and their population concentration would increase. But we're not doing that. They will be free to leave the property.
we live in a free society. We don't tell our deer where to go. My question simply is, my question simply is that by fencing in the wooded area to the right and left of SP 11, we will be allowing the deer to concentrate to the extent they're on this property to the unfenced area. Isn't that correct?
They will be more confined in their movement. That is correct.
And therefore, they will be able to have a greater browsing impact on that forest than they do today. Isn't that correct?
Well, we've had this conversation, I think, from many residents asking the same question. And the answer is certainly the deer will have less room to browse in this area, and it could have a greater negative impact. As we've talked about, part of the goal of having the deer fencing plus the planting of native plants in the disturbed area is to begin to get a higher concentration of seeding in these areas with the hopeful growth of greater plant number here, because we'll have so much more coming from this area, the undisturbed area. We'll have so much more transplantation, if you will, of the seeding and of plant movement than we did before. Now, will the deer be, again, they have less room to roam, so they will roam in this small area as they do today. The impact will be variable. In this area, if the wrong species, and I say wrong only insofar as saying if all of the native species planted happen to be deer preferred, then there's going to have to be a greater level of work done here to protect them. Again, either using chemical repellents, and let me be very clear, when I say chemical repellent, we're talking about non-toxic repellents that contain pepper, oils, that sort of thing that the deer find unpalatable.
Well, my question was simply if we're fencing off large parts of the site on the right and left, the deer that tend to live in this area will tend to concentrate more on the unfenced area and hence do their browsing there in greater intensity than they are right now.
Or they will move to other areas.
Well, you mean backyards?
Well, it could come up to here. This area is not neither undisturbed or disturbed. Those are different properties, but they're vacant right now.
Well, presumably that's already happening because that's an existing condition, right?
It's possible.
So in other words, this will cause greater focus of the deer on the unfenced wooded areas. Isn't that fair to say?
The deer will have less room to roam.
Okay. Is it a yes to my question?
It's not, these aren't yes or no types of questions. This is wildlife. Wildlife doesn't, the deer don't read the books and they don't read the studies. So the odds are very good that they will walk through here and find, oh, I can't go in this fenced area, so I have to go somewhere else.
Well, I'm not gonna
Trying to answer your question. They won't overly concentrate in a given area if there is nothing for them to eat. Right now, there is very limited deer browsing here. We hope to actually increase the number of plants growing. If I lose some to deer browse, I'm fine with that overall because I will have increased the health of the deer and the forest simultaneously. And also, and most importantly, by the way, why don't we focus on deer a great deal?
Well,
My other concern is, or my other benefit of the deer fencing, sorry, when we have areas that begin to regenerate with undergrowth, I benefit smaller game. I'll benefit rabbits, I'll benefit other small wildlife because they'll have more areas to hide. They'll have more areas to eat themselves, rabbits, for example, et cetera. So generally what we find is when areas are deer fenced and you get regeneration, all wildlife benefits.
I just asked if this part of the forest is going to get more browsing, yes or no?
It's possible.
Okay, thank you. Have you done any study as to the impact of the construction as shown on SP 11 on the wetlands that are below the area to be developed?
No, that's outside of my area. I rely on wetlands protection to be with the Department of Environmental Protection.
Well, there are trees in the wetlands, are there not?
It's an undisturbed area. It will be determined as to what can be done. There are buffers and requirements that the DEP will determine have to be met.
Well, stormwater runoff from the developed area will be diverted to detention basins. And is it fair to say that it will no longer go to the wetlands as it has been? And wouldn't that affect the ecology of the trees that live there?
We didn't ask him to do that. We didn't ask him to look at that. We didn't ask him to do that.
Well,
We didn't want to talk about the wetlands.
Site and the impact of the plan, I'm asking, won't this affect the wooded areas in the wetlands?
I don't think that's a question for the engineer.
Yeah, that's,
Well, I don't think the engineer knows much about trees. This gentleman says he does know about trees, so I'm asking the gentleman who says he knows about trees.
he didn't look about, he didn't look at the tree. We didn't ask him to look at trees in the wetland because we have, the applicant nor us have any control over that.
Well,
Okay,
I'm simply asking whether he did that analysis.
okay, you can ask whether he did or not.
I did not do a secondary analysis. Stormwater was done by the engineers and it's done by DEP.
Right, let's just be clear. I'm not, right, I'm not asking about stormwater analysis. I'm asking about impacts on the wetlands from the deviation of the normal stormwater
All of
flow.
that is determined by the Department of Environmental Protection. It's outside of my purview.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you. I appreciate that. Now, You turn to the slide documenting the number of trees to be lost from the project. I don't recall the title of the slide.
I don't.
I think you know what I mean, right?
Is that it?
Hey, let me look at my
This
copy.
General findings.
Yeah.
Talks about the acreage. And
Let
total
me-
tree, no, that's not it.
No, I think
sorry.
I'm looking at tree removal
No,
calculation.
You're right.
Is that the one?
That's the slide you're referring to, right?
By the way, it's not a criticism, but it's easier if page numbers go on these the next time. It makes-
You have that before. That's on me.
That's right, I'm just saying.
That's my bad.
So I just want to clarify get into the record, the actual numbers. The area of disturbance is 27.5 acres. We agree on, correct?
That's not cheap.
Sorry?
The numbers actually appear as a
No,
consequence.
but they don't change when you flip them.
Oh, they don't?
No.
What do you mean?
Yeah.
What's the matter?
We thought that there was numbers on the
Oh,
top.
It's
Right.
22 pages, but you're saying.
Oh,
It doesn't
it-
change.
I don't know.
Yeah,
This
it-
is not the power.
Right,
right.
Yeah, so I'm referring to as much as I can to the title,
Yeah,
so that if
no.
anyone looks at this, we know as best we can what we're
Well,
referring.
we thought maybe there was another way,
Right,
but.
yeah. I'm sorry, is it possible to make it a drop darker? I just can't see. I appreciate that. Thank you, perfect. So the area of disturbance on this slide is 27.5 acres, and the total number of trees. The maximum tree removal is listed as 5,830 trees, is that correct?
Correct.
And you find on this slide, you indicate a total trees on site as plus or minus 25,440. Is that correct?
Yes,
And by site, you mean the 120 acre property?
correct.
Okay, thank you. Now, it does say a minimum of trees preserved forever, a minimum of 77% of trees preserved forever. There was some discussion of this from the public. Does that mean is a conservation easement to your knowledge that will be on the property, or is a voluntary preservation by the developer?
Can't speak to what the ordinance says. I can just say that area, that's the undisturbed area. I
Okay.
believe that's all referenced in the ordinance.
That's fine. Did you do any study of this site in terms of the effect on the property of fragmentation of the forest?
No,
And by fragmentation, do you understand, I mean the removal, say, of 27 acres approximately from the center of the site?
yes, I understand what you're saying. No,
Wouldn't, why wouldn't the study on fragmentation be relevant to determining ultimately the future health of the property?
Joe, can I ask you the why is that, please? This one? Yeah, that must be 11. No, it's okay. That's it, that's fine.
The numbers are changing.
Yes, that's.
Oh, the numbers are moving. All right,
Yeah,
slide
12.
12. It is working. Slide 12 for future reference as well.
At the top.
You won't see it from there. It's only up here.
22.
See it?
Oh, so that will be.
That's the page.
12.
Or slide 12.
Oh, well, you see, that's the problem on the printed version.
It won't appear on the printed version.
It doesn't come out on a printed version, so
Uh,
that's why
Right.
if there were a record that needs to be looked at. I still feel like we should refer.
That's okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
This is SP 11, put it in context.
Yes.
Because that's slide.
So my,
So to answer your question about fragmentation, this forest is not being very heavily fragmented. For the most part, it'll be contiguous with the exception, of course, of the road passages that are here. But otherwise, there is contiguous passage throughout, disregarding the fenced area, of course, which we are purposely pulling out of this. But fragmentation typically refers to something where if I took this entire piece and came down to the bottom of the slide and all the way up to here, now I've fragmented this forest into two pieces rather than what we have here. Part of the basis here in this design, which I like, is that the forest, while not completely contiguous, this is not an access road. So there actually is contiguous passage throughout this area. There is certainly some fragmentation, obviously, where we're putting, where the building will be put. and where the primary road is. But depending on what this board does, of course, even this road would be not an impediment to passage if in fact the road is not for daily use. So there's quite a bit of free movement is, I guess, the way I would put that. It's
Well,
not fragmenting the forest as say this development in Essex Fells did, or this development in West Orange did. This is fragmenting the forest. This is what we talk about when we say fragmentation. This kind of suburban, single-family home development. This is what's highly damaging.
Is it fair to say that you don't consider the construction of these four very large buildings with parking facilities in the center of this forest to be fragmenting it?
People say that. What I said
Is it
relative
fragmenting it, yes or no?
fragmentation Is minor compared to the other types of development. In green building design, one of the things you try and do to minimize damage and to minimize fragmentation is to concentrate development into the smallest footprint possible. This does that. This type of development here, this type of development here, and this type of development here is much more impactful on a forest. And it's historic. Now, these are historic buildings. I'm not suggesting there's anything wrong with it. It's all done to code, I'm sure. But from a green building standpoint, and a forestry standpoint, this is infinitely more destructive to the environment than what this is proposing, because this minimizes fragmentation. Certainly is a form of fragmentation, I will not argue that. But it is less impactful on an overall basis than most other types of development.
My question was only, did you do any study on the effect on the ecology of the site due to the fragmentation from this project?
And I think I answered that.
Did you do any such study?
No, it was outside of my purview.
That's all I asked. Thank you. Did you do any analysis of fauna that are present on the site, aside from your observing 7 to 10 deer on that occasion?
Just in the one day, no, we did not do a wildlife analysis, it was not part of our charge.
Have you done any the question will probably be the same, answer will be the same, I imagine, but let me just be clear for the record. Did you do any analysis on the impact of bird migration across this property or life histories of birds that live on this site?
We did not do any analysis of wildlife at all, anything to do with wildlife specifically is within DEP's purview.
Well, whether it is or is not, I'm not sure. I simply asked whether you did the analysis.
The answer is no.
I'm sorry, I'm just going through my notes quickly. I don't want to.
That's okay.
I'm a little puzzled. because when you testified at the last meeting, either directly or in response to questions, you said that, I wrote down what you said, I think it's a pretty accurate quote, I look at everything, birds, plants, et cetera, from the holistic point of view. Do you recall saying that?
Yes.
Well, then why didn't you do any study of wildlife or birds and the impact of this project on that wildlife? If that's what you do holistically.
First, as I stated, I was not charged with doing a wildlife analysis because I know that DEP will be looking at whether or not there are endangered species or whether or not there are any other species of concern, either plant or animal on the site. When I say that, as an environmental scientist, I look holistically at the property, wildlife et al. I am looking to see what the general impacts are of anything on a property. First, looking at this property, and based on my observations, and on a tree study, but on my observations as well, I can see that it's an unhealthy wildlife habitat simply because there is very little variation or understory growth. To have a healthy wildlife habitat, you need to have healthy tiers of growth. You need ground growth, you need understory growth, you need shrubs, which are understory, small trees and large trees. The greater the variety of plants on the property, when I look at a forest, I look at the variation of the plants. Yes, I have variation of species, but the answer to the question that you've asked was an answer to a question of what is the difference between what a forester or an arborist might look at, or a tree expert might look at, compared to what an environmental scientist or ecologist might look at on a property. And as I was explaining that at that time, I was trying to explain that an arborist or a forester or a tree expert is looking at a very simple, and let me rephrase, that's not fair, in a much more myopic view. Yes, do they take into account that there are other issues within that forest? Certainly. But they don't look at it for that reason. They all have different charges for different components. I was explaining that. That's where that answer comes from. In my case, when I look at a forest, I am looking at it and saying, because of the way I was trained, hey, is this forest healthy for all things living? My answer in this forest is no.
Well, you told us that your holistic approach means you look at birds, plants, everything. It's fair to say you didn't look at wildlife at all. Isn't that correct?
No. What is fair to say is I did not do any sort of an analysis about wildlife on the property. I made observational changes, I made observations, on the property and drew conclusions predicated on my experience of what a healthy forest should be with bad wildlife.
As to wildlife, the only observation you reported to the board was that there were 7 to 10 deer that you saw. Isn't that correct?
Statistically, there is no data given to the board. All I stated to the board was in the one day, we happened to see 7 to 10 deer. I did not do a statistical wildlife analysis on this property.
I simply asked, aside from saying you saw 7 to 10 deer on the site, you offered no other information about wildlife on the property. Isn't that correct?
I did not offer a wildlife analysis on this property. I was not charged with doing so.
That's all I'm asking. What data do you have in terms of the damage to the deer fence from other sites that have been fenced from tree fells and related matters?
I don't have specific data on that.
Thank you. I just need a moment to speak to my colleague for a second. I'd like to talk to you about the tree species that you identified on the site. You identify some of them in your report at item 3 on page 2, oak. Several species of oak, rather, maples, hickory, flowering dogwood, sassafras, American beech, black cherry. Are there any others that you've identified on the site? Is there another chart that contains that reference?
In the original tree study, there were a number of other species identified. We just didn't, we weren't asked to do an identification, they were observed. But we had a number of others that were there that were greater than 4 inches in diameter. We observed, I think we said red maple already. We
I said-
observed- Yeah, right.
I said maple in general.
Okay, we observed red maple, black birch. I'm using the common language, common names, not Latin. Pignut hickory, shagbark hickory, mockernut hickory, American beech, green ash, tulip, black gum, white oak, chestnut oak, excuse me, red oak, black oak, and sassafras, which I think you did mention. In that site. Those are the ones we just happened to observe. There might be others, but that would be a good mix of what's in that property. Some of those are wetland species, some of them are not.
Well, so there are a few that you did not include, the tulip, a black gum, and black tulip and black gum, for example. Now, in terms of these species, in terms of the large trees you've seen, 24 to 36 inches. What is the average lifespan of these trees?
Every one of these trees has a different lifespan.
Well,
Oaks could, a white oak, the oldest living one was recently cut down that I know of was 250 years old. That was cut down in Basking Ridge about a year or two ago, I believe. It was down since the time of Washington. The Washington oak down in Princeton lived over 200 years. That was also, I believe, a white oak. Trees such as sassafras and cherry, black cherry have a relatively short lifespan. Sassafras might live 50 years. And again, bear in mind, when I say lifespan, we all have a lifespan. It's totally variable on the conditions the tree is experiencing at the time. So some of these are shorter lived, some are longer lived. Tulip trees can have a pretty good lifespan, but they tend to be very brittle. So it's all over.
What were the
No
general-
good answer is the short answer here.
well, I assume that. I'm asking about the different species. What will be the lifespan typically of a tulip tree?
It really varies. I mean, tulip tree can live over 100 years, but it may not. You know, there are a number of other factors that affect that, of course.
Now, what about the various maple species that you've seen on the site?
Same thing. I mean, it's all variable.
Well, I'm asking about the different species.
It's all variable. I mean, trees live anywhere from, there are sugar maples, which we can particularly observe, but you may have seen when they were on the last visit. There are sugar maples well over 100 years old in the United States. But I can't tell you the age of any given tree on a given property, because you really can't judge a tree by look.
I don't mean to
Say it.
interrupt you. I
Yeah,
didn't, I don't mean to interrupt you. I didn't ask you to judge the age of a given tree. I just asked you to typically identify the lifespan of the different species you've
The oldest
identified.
trees in our area could be 250 years old. None of these would be, in my opinion. The oldest living things, of course, are not in this area, but the oldest trees in this area, the oldest species, what would be the term I'm looking for? The greatest life expectancy of species in this area, probably in the 250 years. That's
All right,
a pretty good run if you're a tree.
well, you're referring to the oaks at 250.
Hmm.
You were referring to the oak trees at 250. Now, let's talk about the maple species. What is the different species of maple you identified? Red maple, for example, what is its typical lifespan?
Top of my head, I don't know. It's variable. It's not anywhere near an oak.
Do you know it? Yes or no?
No, I don't have that on top of my head.
Black birch, what's its typical lifespan?
Again, I haven't memorized the life expectancy of every species of tree. Black birch would have what I would call a relatively short life expectancy compared to an oak or a maple.
Do you have any knowledge of the typical life expectancy of black birch?
As I just stated, I have not memorized life expectancy of species. I certainly could look them up, but I have not memorized.
Shagbark hickory.
Shagbark hickories can live a long time, but again, I can't give you a specific life expectancy because I have not memorized the life expectancy of each species. Hickory would be a longer lived species than birch.
Do you have any understanding of the typical lifespan of shagbark hickory?
I have not memorized the individual life expectancies of individual species.
Okay, Mr. Efron, that's done. We're done with the tree life. He says we're gonna put that all together. He doesn't know the life of the trees. Let's move on.
Well, I'm testing the point.
Thank you.
Thank you. With respect to the condition of approval that you recommended on the areas of disturbance to identify specimen trees, that survey would be done only after approval of the plan under your recommendation. Is that correct?
I don't know how the sequence works.
Well, you said it would be a condition of approval, didn't you?
I just don't understand I don't understand the sequence in the process. I can't answer.
Well, you said in your report that you recommended as a condition of approval, didn't you? That there be a survey done as to specimen trees in the area of disturbance.
I know that's what it says in the report, but I can't answer as to the sequence of the way things occur. I don't know.
Well, wouldn't that occur only after the plan is approved if it's a condition of approval?
I'd be guessing. I don't know. You'd have to ask counsel or someone else. I'm not familiar with the procedural sequence that they would follow.
So no survey of specimen trees in terms of the area of disturbance has been done as of yet. Is that correct?
Correct. My recommendation is that we do.
All right, now if the specimen trees are identified where the buildings are, or where the roads are gonna be, or where the detention basins are gonna be, or other structures, we will have a conflict between your goal of preserving them and the plan, which would allow them to be destroyed. Isn't that so?
No.
Well, how will you then build this project if the specimen trees are in the middle of building C, for example?
A specimen tree, if a specimen tree or a tree of interest and note of size is found where there's a building, that tree is not going to be considered for preservation. The goal is to try to find those trees that might be within the area of disturbance, that might be in such a way or in an area in such a way that we could preserve them. For example, and I don't have an exact tree here, just bear that in mind with me, right? And Joe, could you zoom in on that for just a moment for me, please? I'm sorry.
It's only 10 o'clock.
I have that effect on people, I'm sorry. Sorry. That time in 3 minutes. So just by illustration, okay, if you have an area where it's going to be unpaved, but still theoretically in the area of disturbance, let's say right here, just as an argument's sake, let's just say hypothetically, we are GIS plotting and everything else, we say, hey, you've got a 36-inch white oak sitting here. That would be a point of negotiation then with the builder and say, look, you've got this really nice specimen tree, we've got it marked and tagged, and we work around it and fence around it. Whether that tree would live, hard to say, you never know, but if the builder is willing to work with us on it, that's what we would do. It's the same would be true throughout this complex. If there's a tree here, for example, that might provide shade, and it happens to be a specimen tree, and we could work to save it, that's what we'd be identifying. Where trees are in the middle of roadways, there's nothing we're doing to them. They may be there, but they're not going to be saved.
And where they're in the middle of buildings, for example, the same would apply.
Of course, yeah.
Don't you think this survey should be done before the plan is approved to know whether some large number of specimen trees or valuable trees, trees of interest ought to be destroyed?
No.
Mr. Efron, we're gonna time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. The next special meeting of the planning board will be held December 11th, 6:30 PM in council chambers. No additional notice will be required, and that will be for application PB 24-01, West Essex Highlands Incorporated, Block 179, Lot 32, Zone IH1, where Mr. DeFeo will continue with crossed by Mr. Efron. Mr. Efron's going to have something on the website tomorrow or the next day.
Would I be all right if I did it on Monday? I tend to doubt I'll get it off by
Monday?
by Friday. Yeah, is it Monday, right?
Monday. One of the things, Mr. Efron, just housekeeping, are the people that you represent in week here, they know they're not to speak. And they haven't come up to the microphone to ask questions. Is that
I
correct?
don't believe they have at this point. There was one individual who did want to raise an issue personal to her property, not in terms of the group interest. So I was going to raise that specially before she did. One or two of those individuals or some of those individuals might be called as witnesses by me, but that decision hasn't been made
That's
yet.
different.
But I've instructed them not to speak in the public portion.
Perfect. Thank
Thank
you.
Mr. Chairman, can I confirm no further notice required for the December 11th meeting?
No further
Okay.
notice will be required. Absolutely. And the next regular planning board meeting will be held Wednesday, December 4th, 2024 at 7:30 PM via Zoom. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
Motion.
So moved. All in favor?
Aye. Aye.
Any nays? The ayes are above the nose. Thank you all. Thank you all on Zoom. Have a wonderful evening.